In a room full of powerful men competing for one woman's attention, a 6-year-old boy walked past all of them. Past the suits, past the wealth, past everything his mother's world said mattered, and he stopped in front of the one man nobody saw coming. The man who drove a school bus. The man who never once tried to be chosen. What happened next silenced an entire ballroom. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like and stay with me until the very end. This one's worth it. The bus smelled like old vinyl and cheap pine air freshener, and Ethan Carter had stopped noticing both a long time ago. He pulled out of the depot at 6:47 every morning, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, always caught, because that was just how he was built. His daughter Maya used to tease him about it from her car seat when she was little, back when he still had to bring her along during the rough months after the divorce. "Daddy, why you always early? Early is boring." She'd said it with complete seriousness, her lower lip pushed out, her tiny arms crossed like she was making a legal argument. He'd laughed so hard he'd nearly missed a stop sign. Maya was 8 now and took the bus herself like a regular kid, sitting in the 4th row on the right side because that was her spot and had been since 1st grade, and God help anyone who tried to take it. She didn't need him hovering over her anymore. That was a good thing. He told himself that every morning. Ethan was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked tired even when it wasn't. Not in a sad way, more like he'd seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a fender bender when he was 19, dark circles that no amount of sleep ever fully erased, and hands that were rougher than they should have been for a man his age. He'd worked 3 jobs after the divorce: warehouse loading, weekend security at a mall, and then the bus route. The bus route was the one that stuck because it let him be home when Maya got home. That was the whole calculation. There was no romantic reason behind it, no calling or sense of purpose. He needed a job that bent around his kid, and this one did. The route ran through the Cloverdale district, a mix of neighborhoods that didn't quite know what they wanted to be. Old ranch houses sat next to newer townhomes. A struggling Vietnamese restaurant was sandwiched between a craft brewery and a tax prep office that had been there since 1987. The kids on Ethan's bus reflected all of it: messy, loud, sweet, annoying, complicated little people in various stages of figuring out the world. He knew all their names. That wasn't required, but he knew them anyway. He knew that Jalen Thompson always sat in the back and pretended to sleep so he didn't have to talk to anyone, but perked up the second someone mentioned basketball. He knew that the Reyes twins fought constantly, but would absolutely destroy anyone who picked on the other. He knew that Sophie Park brought homemade rice crackers every Thursday and shared them with whoever was sitting next to her, and that Marcus Webb sometimes didn't have lunch money and tried to hide it behind a big grin. Ethan wasn't a counselor or a teacher or anything like that. He just paid attention. It wasn't a skill he'd cultivated. It was more like a reflex. You noticed kids when you had one of your own. The first Monday of October started like any other. He pulled up to the stop on Wren Street at 7:14, right on time, and opened the doors. 3 kids climbed on, then a 4th. Then a small boy Ethan had never seen before stepped up onto the first step and stopped. He was tiny for his age, maybe 6 or 7, with dark hair that had been combed carefully. Too carefully. The kind of careful that said an adult had done it, not him. He wore a navy blue jacket with the collar turned slightly up on one side, khaki pants with a crease ironed into them, and sneakers that were clean in the way expensive sneakers are clean, wiped down, not worn down. He had a backpack that probably cost more than anything in Ethan's apartment. The boy stood at the top of the steps and looked at the bus like he was assessing a situation he hadn't been briefed on. Ethan waited. He'd learned not to rush kids at the door. "Hey there," he said. Not chipper, not performatively warm, just normal. "You new?" The boy didn't answer. He looked at Ethan directly, which was unusual. Most kids in that moment looked at the floor or at the other kids, or anywhere but the adult asking the question. This one looked straight at him with dark eyes that were older than his face deserved. Then he walked past Ethan and sat down in the first available seat, which happened to be right behind the driver's partition. He put his backpack on his lap, folded his hands on top of it, and stared forward. Ethan glanced at the roster the district office had updated that morning. New student, Route 14, pick up Wren Street, Oliver Hayes, age 6, grade 1. He closed the door and pulled back into the street. In his rearview mirror, he could see Oliver's reflection. The boy didn't look out the window the way new kids usually did. He didn't try to make eye contact with anyone around him. He just sat there, very still, like someone who'd learned that stillness was a form of protection. By the end of that first week, Ethan had picked up pieces of the story the way you always do in a school district, through the ambient noise of adults who forget kids are around, and kids who overhear everything and repeat half of it. Oliver Hayes didn't talk. Not couldn't. The kid understood everything, responded to instructions, did his work. He just didn't speak. Hadn't spoken apparently in almost 2 years. The teachers said it carefully, in the particular tone that teachers use when they're trying to be professional about something that quietly breaks their hearts. Selective mutism, one of the classroom aides told another at the curb one afternoon. Since his dad died, he was 4. Just stopped. Ethan didn't ask follow-up questions. It wasn't his business. But the information settled into him and stayed there, the way certain things do. He kept doing what he'd done since that first morning. He said hello when Oliver got on, said goodbye when Oliver got off, and didn't make any kind of production out of the fact that he never got a response. He treated the kid like any other kid on the route, which meant he occasionally told him to move his backpack when someone needed the seat, and once told him to keep his feet off the seat back in front of him. Oliver had looked faintly startled both times, like he'd expected to be treated differently, and didn't know quite what to do with the fact that he wasn't. The other kids on the bus had mostly accepted Oliver's silence the way kids accept strange things, quickly, without ceremony, and then moved on. Some of them had tried to talk to him in the first couple of weeks. Jalen had asked him if he played video games. Sophie had offered him a rice cracker. Marcus had showed him a YouTube video on a cracked phone screen. Oliver had watched the video. He hadn't responded to the other two, but he hadn't been rude about it either. By mid-October, most of them had just sort of made room for him. He existed. He was on the bus. That was that. Maya, characteristically, took longer to let it go. "Dad," she said one afternoon after Oliver had gotten off at his stop, "is that boy okay?" "Which boy?" "The quiet one." "Oliver." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "He's fine. He never talks." "Some people don't talk as much." Maya considered this with the particular gravity that 8-year-olds bring to questions they've decided are important. "He looks sad. He's been through something hard." "What happened to him?" "That's his private business, Bug." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Maybe he just needs a friend." Ethan looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was watching out the window now, distracted by something on the street, already moving on to the next thought. He looked back at the road. Maybe, he thought. But that's not something you can force. November came in cold and gray, and the bus developed a heating problem that the district took 3 weeks to fix. During those 3 weeks, Ethan brought an extra thermos of coffee and wrapped his hands around it at red lights and tried not to think about how much he hated paperwork, which was the only thing standing between him and getting the heat fixed faster. Oliver had started wearing a heavier jacket. It was still carefully pressed. Whoever was getting him ready in the morning took that seriously. One Tuesday, Ethan arrived at the Wren Street stop to find Oliver already there, standing at the curb in the dark at 7:09, 5 minutes early. He was the only one there. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at nothing in particular, and when the bus pulled up and the doors opened, he climbed on without any change in expression. Ethan almost said something and then didn't, but the next morning he got to Wren Street 2 minutes early, and Oliver was already there again, standing in the cold, alone. This time Ethan did say something. "You're always early," he said as Oliver came up the steps. Oliver looked at him. "I used to be the same way," Ethan said, like he was just talking to himself, which was more or less how he'd learned to talk to kids who weren't talking back, not expecting a response, not setting up a conversational trap, just saying a thing. "Still am, actually. Drives my daughter crazy." He didn't gesture at Maya, who was already in her seat and had her headphones on. He just said it and then closed the doors and pulled out. In the rear view, Oliver was looking out the window, but his hands, which usually stayed folded on his backpack, were resting slightly differently. Not tense, just resting. It was a small thing. Ethan noticed it anyway. He saw her for the first time in late November, which meant he'd been driving Oliver for nearly 2 months before he connected the boy to her name. He'd seen the name, obviously. Oliver Hayes on his roster. Hayes on the occasional note sent home through the backpack that Oliver delivered with the silent efficiency of a courier. But he hadn't connected it to anything until the day the car was waiting at the stop. A black SUV, late model, driver in the front, and a woman climbed out of the back before Oliver could get off the bus. She was dressed for a meeting. Dark coat, structured and expensive, the kind that looked like it had been selected by someone whose job it was to make sure she always looked like she meant business. Her hair was pulled back cleanly. She was maybe 5'6" and carried herself like she was 5'10", not in an aggressive way, more like she'd stopped apologizing for taking up space a long time ago. She was Ethan registered without particular fanfare, strikingly beautiful. He noticed it the way you notice that a building is architecturally interesting, with an appreciation that didn't require him to do anything about it. She walked to the bus door. Oliver had stopped at the top of the steps. "Hey, baby," she said. Her voice was softer than her posture suggested. "I just wanted to catch you before. I have a thing tonight. I'll be late. Mrs. Kim's going to be there, okay? She'll have dinner." Oliver looked at her. Something passed between them that Ethan couldn't read. She reached up and fixed the collar of his jacket, the one that was always slightly turned up on one side. Her hand stayed on his shoulder for just a second longer than was necessary, and then she stepped back. "You have a good day," she said. Oliver came down the steps, walked past her, and got into the car. Victoria Hayes stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the car door close. Then she looked up at Ethan, who was sitting in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel, and for a second they just looked at each other. "He's been okay? On the bus?" she asked. "He's been fine," Ethan said. "No problems." She nodded. Her jaw did a small thing, some kind of controlled adjustment, like she had more she wanted to say and was actively choosing not to. "Okay. Thank you." She turned and walked back to the SUV, and the whole thing had taken less than 90 seconds. Ethan pulled the doors shut and continued the route. He didn't think about it much for the rest of the day, or that's what he told himself. December brought the school holiday concert, which meant the bus was chaos for 2 straight weeks because kids were either thrilled or miserable about having to sing in public, and there was no in-between. Oliver sat through all of it with his standard arrangement of stillness. But Ethan noticed, or thought he noticed, that the kid had started positioning himself slightly differently on the bus. He used to sit so that he was perpendicular to everything, facing forward, not engaging. Now he sometimes angled himself toward the aisle, which put him fractionally closer to the orbit of the kids around him. He still didn't talk, but he watched things more openly than he used to, less like he was observing a situation he needed to survive, more like he was just watching. The week before winter break, Ethan's truck broke down. This was not a dramatic event. His truck had been threatening to break down for about 4 months, and he'd been ignoring the sounds it made because he didn't have the money to deal with it before Christmas, and he'd miscalculated the timing, which was what happened when you tried to stretch something past its natural limit. He'd had to call a friend for a ride to the depot that morning and had arrived at work in a borrowed jacket because his regular one was in the truck, and he hadn't thought to grab it. He was cold and slightly annoyed and trying not to be either of those things visibly when Oliver got on the bus at Wren Street. The boy stopped at the top of the steps, looked at Ethan, then looked at him again, slightly more specifically. Ethan realized Oliver had noticed the different jacket. "Truck broke down," Ethan said, explaining himself to a 6-year-old, apparently. "Wearing my friend's coat. Charming look, right?" Oliver looked at him for another second. Then he walked to his seat. Ethan pulled out into traffic. 3 minutes later, he felt something land on his right shoulder. He looked down. It was a small bag of crackers, the kind from a vending machine, cheese-flavored. He looked in the rear view. Oliver was facing forward, hands on his backpack, expression neutral. Ethan picked up the crackers. He didn't make a speech about it, didn't thank the kid effusively, didn't turn around to look at him, didn't bring attention to it. He just opened the bag at the next red light and ate a couple. And in the rearview mirror, something shifted almost imperceptibly in Oliver's face. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. He didn't see Oliver for 2 weeks during the break. His own apartment was small but not oppressive. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that looked out on an alley, a living room with a second-hand couch that Maya had declared her favorite object in the world and would not allow replaced. He'd put up a small tree. He'd gotten Maya a new tablet that he probably shouldn't have bought, budget-wise, but he'd done the math 3 times and decided it was fine, and then immediately knew it wasn't quite fine, but it was Christmas and she was 8. Maya's mother, Cassandra, had her on Christmas Eve in the morning of Christmas Day, and then Ethan picked her up at 2 in the afternoon and they watched movies until she fell asleep on the good couch, and he carried her to bed. This was the ritual. It worked. He didn't date. He'd tried twice in the years since the divorce, and both times had petered out around the 2-month mark, which was about the point where he'd have to actually be vulnerable about something, and he'd found both times that he just didn't. Not because he was emotionally unavailable in some dramatic sense, but because he didn't have the bandwidth, and because he'd learned that his instinct was to protect Maya from anything uncertain, which made bringing someone new into the picture feel like a risk calculation he couldn't quite clear. He was fine. He told himself this regularly, which he recognized was what you did when you needed to keep telling yourself something. He was fine. He picked up extra hours during the break driving a charter route, which was boring but paid decently, and he got the truck fixed, mostly, for slightly less than he'd feared. January started dry and cold. The depot smelled like antifreeze and bad coffee. He pulled out at 6:47 and drove to Wren Street, and Oliver was already there at the curb, 5 minutes early, hands in his pockets. Same as before. Everything the same. Ethan opened the doors. "Happy New Year?" he said. Oliver looked at him, climbed the steps, sat down. Ethan pulled out. The route continued. But somewhere in those 2 weeks, without anything specific having happened, something had settled between them. Not friendship, not exactly. Something quieter. Like Oliver had run a calculation of his own and arrived at a conclusion that Ethan wasn't dangerous, wasn't performing, wasn't going to suddenly need something from him. It wasn't fixed. Nothing about this kid was fixed, and Ethan didn't think of it that way. But it was something. The news about Victoria Hayes wasn't something Ethan went looking for. It found him, the way most things did in the age of algorithms. A headline on his phone while he was eating lunch in the depot break room in February, placed there by something that had noticed he'd looked at a local business article once and had now decided he was interested in the subject. Victoria Hayes, CEO of Hayes Meridian, makes stunning promise at Investors Gala. He almost scrolled past it. He did scroll past it. Then he scrolled back. The article was 3 days old. It included a photo of her at a podium. Same composure, same quality of presence he'd seen at the bus stop, and a quote that the reporter had clearly decided was the story. "I've been asked 100 times what kind of man I'd choose. Here's my answer. I'll marry the man my son chooses, and since Oliver doesn't talk to anyone, you're all safe." There had apparently been laughter in the room. The article described it as charmed laughter, which was the kind of phrase that told you the journalist had been charmed and was embarrassed about it. Ethan read the article twice. He set his phone down and ate the rest of his sandwich. He knew enough about Victoria's world from the periphery to understand what the statement had actually been. Not a romantic declaration, but a strategic wall. She'd been dealing with men who wanted proximity to her money and influence, and she'd found a way to shut the conversation down using the one thing nobody could argue with: her kid. It was smart. It was also, he suspected, not something she'd said without some degree of pain underneath it. What he hadn't anticipated was that the announcement would apparently be taken as a competition by some people. Over the next several weeks, he noticed, you couldn't not notice if you were watching Oliver, that the men in Victoria's orbit had apparently decided that winning Oliver over was now the play. He could tell because Oliver would sometimes get on the bus with things: a branded baseball cap from a sports team, a toy helicopter still in its packaging, a gift card tucked into his jacket pocket. Oliver never seemed particularly excited by any of it. He always looked like someone who'd received a thing from someone who needed him to be happy about receiving the thing, and had done the math correctly, and found the whole arrangement exhausting. The helicopter stayed in his backpack for a week and then disappeared. Ethan assumed it had either been forgotten or given away. One morning, Oliver got on the bus, sat down, and pulled out a toy race car. Bright red, expensive-looking, remote-controlled, and held it for a minute, looking at it with an expression that Ethan couldn't quite decode. Then he very carefully put it back in his bag, closed the zipper, and folded his hands on top. Ethan caught that in the rear view. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? At the next red light, he said without turning around, "Some stuff is nice to look at and not that interesting to keep." He wasn't sure if he was talking to Oliver or himself. He kept driving. "You talk about him," Maya said. They were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, Ethan making pancakes, Maya sitting at the counter doing something with her tablet that she'd explained twice and that he'd nodded along with while understanding approximately 30% of. "Who?" "The quiet kid, Oliver." "You talk about him, but you don't think you're talking about him." Ethan flipped a pancake. "What does that mean?" "Like you'll say, one of the kids on my route did a thing, and then describe the thing and it's always him." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I notice what's happening with the kids on my route. That's part of the job." "Yeah, but you notice him." He put a pancake on her plate. "Eat." She poured an amount of syrup that suggested she had not heard anything he'd ever said about sugar. "I'm just saying, it's okay if you care about a kid. You're a dad. It's like your whole thing." "My whole thing." "You're good at it." She said it very simply, without looking up from the tablet. "Not every dad is. You're one of the good ones." He stood at the stove and didn't say anything. Sometimes Maya said things like that, casual, clean, devastatingly accurate, and he never knew quite what to do with them except stand there and feel it. "Thanks, Bug," he said finally. "You're welcome. Can I have more pancakes?" He made more pancakes. He wasn't sure exactly when it happened. These things don't tend to announce themselves. It was somewhere in April, a Tuesday, one of those mornings when the weather can't decide between winter and spring and lands on a kind of damp gray compromise that makes everything feel slightly unresolved. Oliver had gotten on the bus as usual, sat in his usual spot, hands on backpack. Halfway through the route, there was a stop where Ethan usually paused an extra beat because the Kowalski kids were always running slightly late, and if he waited 8 seconds, he'd catch them and not have to file a missed pickup report. It was one of those small, unofficial adjustments that accumulated over months of driving the same route every day. The Kowalski kids came sprinting around the corner, as expected, red-faced and laughing. Ethan opened the doors. From behind him, very quietly, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, there was a sound. Not a word, just a small sound. Like someone had exhaled with the intention of speaking and then stopped. He looked in the rearview mirror. Oliver was looking at the Kowalski kids who were climbing on board, slightly chaotic, arguing about something involving a granola bar. There was something on Oliver's face that Ethan had not seen before in all these months. He looked like he wanted to laugh, not laughing, wanting to. Right on the edge of it, watching these two ridiculous kids fight about a granola bar at 7:20 in the morning, and something in him had moved toward that. Ethan looked back at the road. He let a small breath out and kept driving. He didn't make anything of it. He wasn't going to make anything of it. But he felt it, in the way you feel a temperature change before you can name it. Something was different, and the difference mattered. He got the call in early May. It was from the district office, which normally made his stomach drop because it was always either paperwork or a parent complaint. But this time it was the principal of Oliver's school, who introduced herself as Dr. Reyes and explained that Hayes Meridian, the company, Oliver's mother's company, was sponsoring a charity gala, and as part of the outreach they'd been invited to send a school representative. "We thought of you," Dr. Reyes said. "You've been on the route where Oliver is, and you're good with people. It's a formal event. You'd need a suit. The company covers expenses." Ethan stared at the wall of his kitchen. "I drive a school bus." "I know, but Oliver's mother specifically mentioned the school, and you're the person who sees her son every day. I think she'd appreciate a familiar face being there." A pause. "You don't have to. I just thought I'd ask." He said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 2 days and then called back and said yes, which surprised him slightly. He told himself it was because turning down a free dinner seemed ungrateful, which was half true. He borrowed a suit from his neighbor Frank, who was slightly broader in the shoulder than Ethan and had better taste in clothes, and stood in the bathroom mirror the night of the gala adjusting the jacket and thinking that he looked exactly like a man wearing someone else's suit, which was accurate. "You look weird," Maya said from the doorway. "Thank you." Like good weird. Like Dad went somewhere weird? She tilted her head. "Are you nervous?" "No." "You're lying." "Go watch your movie." She patted away. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time, straightened the jacket, let out a breath. He was definitely a little nervous. The ballroom was the kind of room that knew exactly how much it cost. Ethan had been in nice places before. He wasn't a man who'd never left his neighborhood. But this was something different. The ceiling alone was a statement. Everything was lit in a way that looked effortless and had clearly required tremendous effort. The kind of crowd that wore expensive things without appearing to notice they were wearing them, which was its own kind of performance. He found his table, school representatives, a small round near the back, introduced himself to the other people seated there, and proceeded to do what he always did in unfamiliar situations. He watched, listened, and mostly stayed out of the way. He spotted Victoria Hayes within the first 10 minutes. She was working the room with a precision that looked natural and probably wasn't, moving from cluster to cluster, saying the right things, laughing at the right moments, maintaining the energy of someone who did this because it was part of the job, not because she found it delightful. Oliver was with her. He was dressed in a small suit, dark navy, a little formal for a 6-year-old, and he stood at his mother's side like a person who had agreed to be present without agreeing to be engaged. He shook hands when hands were extended. He looked at people when they spoke to him. He did not speak back. Several men had made a point of engaging with him over the course of the evening, which Ethan observed from across the room with the particular attention of someone who'd spent months learning how Oliver Hayes existed in space. A man in a gray suit crouched down and did a small magic trick with a coin. Oliver watched it without expression and then looked away. Another man produced a phone showing something, probably a game, and Oliver glanced at the screen and then back to the middle distance. Each time the man's posture deflated almost invisibly. Then he'd straighten up, say something to Victoria, and move on. It had the rhythm of a recurring transaction. Attempt, fail, adjust, repeat. Ethan drank his water and watched and did not walk over because this was not his situation, and Oliver being here did not make it his situation. Then dinner was served, and there were speeches, and the speeches were fine. The kind of speeches that large charitable events require, and that no one will quote tomorrow. Victoria spoke and was excellent at it. Clear, warm, specific about the cause without being maudlin. The kind of speaker who made it look easy in a way that told you she'd worked very hard to make it look easy. Oliver sat at the table near the stage, his hands in his lap, watching his mother. Ethan watched him watching her. And then, during the period after the formal program when music started and people began to move around, Oliver did something. He stood up. Not urgently. He just stood up quietly, the way he did everything, and began to walk. He walked away from the table, away from the men who'd been circling him all evening, away from the center of the room and the noise of it. Ethan didn't understand at first where the boy was going. He thought maybe he needed the bathroom, or was looking for his mother, or had just reached capacity for the evening and was locating an exit. But Oliver was walking in his direction. And then Oliver was closer, and then closer still, and Ethan sat very still because something was happening, and he didn't know what, and he had a strong instinct not to move or influence it in any direction. Oliver stopped in front of him. The boy looked at him, steady, direct, the same way he'd looked at him that very first morning on Wren Street, assessing, careful, older than his face. And then Oliver reached out and put his small hand into Ethan's. The noise of the room continued around them, forks and glasses and conversation. Then, person by person, it began to quiet. People noticed, the way you notice a change in a room's energy before you know what caused it. Oliver looked at the room, at the people who were looking at them, and then he looked back at Ethan, and he said, in a voice that was small and clear and hadn't been heard in public in nearly 2 years, "This is my friend." The room went silent, not gradually, all at once. The kind of silence that a room falls into when everyone, simultaneously, realizes something irreversible has just occurred. Ethan felt the words hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He didn't move. He kept his hand where Oliver had put it, loose, steady, not gripping. He looked at this little boy. This quiet, careful, particular little boy who had spent 2 years in silence and had chosen this moment, this room full of power and money and eyes, to put his hand in a bus driver's and say 2 words. The room remembered Victoria's promise. You could feel it pass through the crowd like current. Ethan looked up and found Victoria across the ballroom. She was standing with one hand at her mouth, and she was not composed. For the first time in the entire evening, she was not composed. Her eyes were bright, and her expression was something he didn't have a word for because it was too many things at once. Astonishment and relief and grief and love and gratitude and something that might have been fear, all of it happening on her face at the same time. He looked back at Oliver. He knelt down. Not because the room was watching, because this was a 6-year-old boy who had done something extraordinarily brave and who deserved to have someone meet him at eye level. "Hey," Ethan said quietly. Oliver looked at him. "That took a lot of guts," Ethan said. "I mean that. That was one of the bravest things I've ever seen anybody do." Oliver's eyes did something complicated. He held Ethan's gaze. "Thank you," Ethan said, "for calling me your friend. I'm proud to be your friend." Then he stood. The room was still watching. Some of them had already drawn the conclusion. He could see it in their faces, the narrative snapping into place. The single mother, the famous promise, the silent boy, the man he'd chosen. Ethan looked at the crowd. He spoke clearly, not loudly, because the room was quiet enough that he didn't need to be loud. This boy just did something he hasn't done in a very long time. He trusted someone enough to say something out loud in a room full of strangers. That matters more than anything else that happened here tonight. He paused. He chose a friend. That's what he said. That's what it was. And that's what it's going to stay, because he deserves to have his moment be exactly what he meant it to be. Not more, not less. The room was very still. "He's 6 years old," Ethan said. "Let's let him have this." Then he looked back down at Oliver, who was watching him with those careful, clear, dark eyes. And Ethan held out his hand. Oliver looked at it. Then, with the particular gravity of a child who has decided something, he took it. They stood there together in the middle of the ballroom, a bus driver and a 6-year-old boy, and the room around them didn't know quite what to do with that, and that was fine. Some things don't need an audience's permission to be real. The silence that followed Ethan's words lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then the room exhaled, a collective, slightly uncomfortable sound, and people began talking again, the way people do when they've witnessed something that exceeded their social vocabulary and need to get back to familiar ground. Ethan stood very still for another moment, Oliver's hand still in his, and let the noise of the room reassemble itself around them. A waiter passed with a tray of glasses. Someone laughed too loudly near the bar. The band picked up something quiet and instrumental, and the room reorganized into smaller conversations, as if what had just happened needed to be processed in private clusters rather than all at once. He felt a presence at the edge of his peripheral vision and turned. Victoria Hayes was walking toward them. She'd recomposed herself, mostly. The professional architecture of her expression was back in place, but incompletely, the way you put a room back together in the dark, and something is always slightly off-center. Her eyes were still doing something she couldn't fully control. She stopped in front of them. She looked at Oliver first, and whatever passed between mother and son in that look was not something Ethan tried to read. Then she looked at Ethan. "I need to," she started, and then stopped. She shook her head very slightly, which he took to mean she didn't have the words she wanted and wasn't going to use the wrong ones. "Thank you," she said instead. "For what you said. To the room. I just said what was true. A lot of people know what's true and choose to say something else." She glanced down at Oliver, who was now looking at the hem of a nearby tablecloth with apparent interest. He hasn't said anything like that to anyone. Not since. She stopped again. "I know," Ethan said. He said it gently. She looked at him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sense of being looked at very directly by someone who was accustomed to assessing things quickly and accurately. Not unkindly, just precisely. "I don't know your name," she said. "Not your first name. The school sent me a list of representatives, but I didn't—" "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Carter." She extended her hand. It was a reflex, the handshake of someone who'd conducted most of her life in professional contexts. He shook it. "Victoria," she said, which he already knew, but he nodded as if he didn't. Oliver had looked up at his name not being said. He looked at his mother's hand in Ethan's. Then he looked back at the tablecloth fringe. "I should get him home," Victoria said. "It's late for him." She said it like she was remembering that he was there, which maybe she'd forgotten for a moment in the middle of everything else. She put her hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Say goodnight, baby." Oliver looked at Ethan. He didn't say goodnight, but he held Ethan's gaze for a long second, and then he stepped closer to his mother, and she bent slightly and said something in his ear that Ethan didn't catch. They left. Ethan watched them go, Victoria's hand on Oliver's back, steering him toward the exit with the efficiency of a woman who'd already moved on to the next thing she had to manage. He stood in the middle of the ballroom in Frank's borrowed suit, and the room went on without him noticing it very much. His phone buzzed. A text from Frank. "How's the fancy thing?" He looked at it for a moment. "Interesting," he typed back. "Be home by 11. He picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, drank it, and started looking for the exit. The drive home in his still slightly broken truck was quiet. He turned the radio on and then off again. The city moved past the windows in the way it does at that hour. A few lit storefronts, the orange wash of street lights, the particular loneliness of intersections at night when the lights are still cycling for traffic that isn't there. He thought about Oliver's face when he'd said, "This is my friend." The particular shape of the words coming out of a kid who hadn't used words in public for 2 years. The way he'd just decided. Walked across that room like he knew exactly where he was going, which maybe he had. Ethan had been doing this job for 4 years. He'd driven a lot of kids. He'd watched a lot of small moments on that bus, kids working through things, figuring out their social geometry, being terrible to each other and then inexplicably kind. He'd learned not to get too attached to any particular narrative because kids were not projects. They were people, and people were unpredictable, and your job was to show up consistently and not require them to perform anything for you. He'd done that with Oliver. He was pretty sure he'd done that. He just hadn't been prepared for what it looked like when it actually landed. He pulled into his parking spot at 11:04, 4 minutes late, which would have bothered him more if he'd had the bandwidth to care. He sat in the truck for a minute. The engine ticked as it cooled. "This is my friend." He got out and went inside. Maya had stayed at a neighbor's and he had the apartment to himself. He took off Frank's jacket, hung it carefully on the back of the chair, and sat on the couch in the dark for a while, not doing anything in particular. Just sitting. He wasn't sure what he felt. That was the honest answer. Too many different things, stacked in a way he couldn't immediately sort, moved by Oliver, wary of what the room had assumed, aware of Victoria's face when she'd found her composure again, and underneath all of it some small uncomfortable thing he didn't want to examine too closely. He went to bed around midnight and lay there in the dark listening to the neighbor's TV through the wall, which was tuned to something with a laugh track. He fell asleep eventually. The next morning, he drove the route. Oliver was at the Wren Street stop at 7:09, 5 minutes early, hands in his pockets, business as usual. Ethan opened the doors. Oliver climbed on. "Morning," Ethan said. Oliver looked at him, walked to his seat, sat down, and just like that, it was just another morning. No ceremony, no follow-up to the night before, just the bus and the route and the ordinary noise of kids who had to be somewhere at 7:30. Ethan pulled out of the stop and thought that maybe that was the right way for it to go. The gala was the gala. Monday morning was Monday morning. Oliver hadn't done what he'd done because he wanted anything to change. He'd done it because it was true, and he'd needed to say it, and now it was said, and they could go back to being whatever they'd been. Which was fine. That was fine. He kept driving. What he didn't know, because he wasn't on social media and didn't read the kind of business press that tracked people like Victoria Hayes, was that the moment in the ballroom had not stayed in the ballroom. Someone had a phone out. Someone always had a phone out. The video was 43 seconds long. It started after Oliver had already taken Ethan's hand and began with, "This is my friend," and ended just after Ethan finished speaking to the crowd. The framing was imperfect, shot from an angle, slightly shaky, the audio catching the ambient noise of the room alongside the words. But it was clear enough. Oliver's face was clear. Ethan's face was clear. What had happened was clear. It had 6,000 views by the time Ethan pulled into the depot after his route. It had 40,000 by noon. He found out from Frank, who called him while he was eating a sandwich in his truck in the depot parking lot, and said without preamble, "Brother, you're on the internet." Ethan stopped chewing. "What?" "Someone at that fancy thing last night filmed you with the kid. It's getting around." Frank paused. "You knew this woman's kid? The CEO lady?" "He's on my route." "People are saying you're going to marry her." Ethan put the sandwich down. "That's ridiculous." "I know it's ridiculous. I'm telling you what people are saying. Comments are—" Frank made a sound like someone being overwhelmed by what they were reading. "There's a lot of opinions." "Frank, some of them are really lovely, actually. Some of them are saying you staged it, which, no offense, you don't have the face for staging things. And some of them are complete lunatics." Another pause. "Mostly lovely, though." "I'm not going to marry anyone." "Obviously, I know that. Look, I'm just giving you a heads up because if someone asks you about it, you should know it's out there." Ethan stared at his windshield. A pigeon was walking along the parking curb with great confidence. "I'm a school bus driver who went to a charity thing for work. There's nothing to say." "Sure," Frank said. "I believe you. The internet is less sure." After he hung up, Ethan searched his own name on his phone for the first time in probably 3 years. Found the video on 2 platforms already, both with more engagement than felt reasonable. He watched it once, which felt strange, watching something you'd been part of, from the outside, and then put his phone in his glove compartment and did not look at it again for the rest of the afternoon. He picked Maya up from school, made dinner, helped with homework. The ordinary machinery of the evening. Maya was absorbed in a project about ecosystems and gave him a 30-minute presentation on the water cycle, unprompted, while he washed dishes. He didn't tell her about the video. She found it herself 2 days later. He should have anticipated that. "Dad." She appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Wednesday evening, her tablet in her hand, her expression the particular one she used when she had discovered information she was processing. "Why are you on TikTok?" He turned from the stove. "What?" She turned the tablet toward him. He could see the video playing. He watched himself kneel in front of Oliver in Frank's slightly too broad jacket in that overlit ballroom. He heard his own voice, small through the tablet speaker. "That's Oliver," Maya said, "the quiet one." "Yes." "He talked." "He did." She was quiet for a moment, watching it finish. Then she looked at him, and her expression had changed. Less processing, more something else. "He walked all the way across the room to find you." "He did?" "Because you're his friend." "That's what he said." Maya set the tablet down on the counter. She was quiet for a little longer than usual, which for Maya was unusual. Then, "The comments say you're going to marry his mom. The comments are wrong. You don't even know her." "I know. The comments are wrong." "Okay." She picked her tablet back up. "The video is really nice, though. Like, even without the married part, it's just a really nice thing." He didn't say anything. "Oliver must really trust you," she said, on her way out of the kitchen, already back in her own thoughts. He turned back to the stove and stood there for a second. "Yeah," he said, to no one. Victoria Hayes, it turned out, had seen the video. He learned this on a Friday morning, not from the video itself, but from the fact that a woman in a well-cut coat was standing next to the black SUV at the Wren Street stop when he pulled up, and she was there before Oliver. She wasn't waiting for Oliver to get off. She was waiting for the bus to arrive, which meant she was waiting for him. He pulled up to the stop, opened the doors, and she walked up to the first step. Not on the bus, just to the door. She looked up at him. She looked, he noticed, like she hadn't been sleeping well. The composure was still there, but it was sitting on top of something more tired and unguarded than he'd seen at the gala. She'd come without the full preparation. A coat, but a simpler one. Hair down instead of pulled back, no particular effort to be impressive. Oliver was still in the car. "I wanted to apologize," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "The video. I've been trying to get it taken down, but—" She stopped. "It's not fully in my control, and it should be. What happened with Oliver was private, and I failed to protect that." Ethan leaned his arm on the doorframe. Is he okay? The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She'd come prepared to apologize, and he'd responded by asking about her kid. She considered. He doesn't know about the video. He doesn't have access to that. But yes, he's okay. She paused again. He's been a little lighter, actually, since that night. She said it like she wasn't sure she should. That's good, Ethan said. It is. She looked at him steadily. I didn't come to ask you anything. I just wanted to apologize in person. Whatever happens with the video, you deserved better than being put in the middle of something you didn't choose. I was fine with what happened, he said. The only thing I cared about was making sure Oliver's moment stayed his. She nodded. Her jaw did that thing he'd noticed at the gala. The small, controlled adjustment of someone who had a lot of feeling and a lot of practice keeping it in a useful shape. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why didn't you? She stopped, started over. A lot of men would have let the room think what it was thinking, would have said something to encourage it. It would have been very easy in that moment to let the narrative go the way the room wanted it to go. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because Oliver wasn't making a statement about your love life. He was saying I was his friend. Those are completely different things, and he's 6, and he deserved for people to hear what he actually said. She was quiet for a moment. Besides, Ethan said, I drive a school bus. I wasn't going to stand in a ballroom and let people think. He stopped, because the end of that sentence had a few possible directions, and none of them were ones he wanted to go. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in proximity to one. Fair enough. Oliver came out of the car then, apparently having decided that whatever was happening had been happening long enough. He walked up to the bus door, registered that his mother was standing there, looked between her and Ethan with an expression of mild inquiry, and then climbed past her and up the steps. He stopped next to Ethan and looked at him. Morning, Ethan said. Oliver walked to his seat. Victoria watched this exchange with the expression of someone who has been trying to solve a problem for 2 years and just watched a 6-year-old render most of the methodology irrelevant. He does that every morning? She asked. Pretty much. Does he ever? He gave me crackers once when my truck broke down, Ethan said. That was the peak. She looked at him. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She laughed, briefly, quietly, but genuinely. Not the controlled, useful laugh he'd watched her deploy at the gala, something that just came out. Crackers, she said. Cheese-flavored vending machine. She looked at her son, visible through the bus window, sitting with his hands folded on his backpack exactly the way he always sat. Then she looked back at Ethan. I'm sorry I didn't come introduce myself sooner, she said. You've been on his route since October. I should have. I just didn't want to. She seemed to recalibrate. I have to be careful about who I let know us. I get that, he said. I don't think you're. She stopped. I don't mean it as an insult. I didn't take it as one. They looked at each other for a moment. He became aware that he was having a longer conversation with Oliver's mother than he'd had with most people in the past month, and that this was not a situation he'd entirely anticipated. I should let you go, she said. You have a route. I do. She stepped back from the door. He started to pull it closed. Mr. Carter? She said. He paused. If you'd ever be willing, she said it carefully. Oliver doesn't have a lot of people he trusts. I won't put you in an uncomfortable position, but if you'd ever want to just, I don't know, get coffee or something, talk about him, I'd like to know what he's like on the bus. I never get to see that. He considered the request for its actual content, which was a mother who was worried about her son and wanted information from someone who saw him daily, which was entirely reasonable. Yeah, he said. Okay. She nodded. The professionalism reassembled itself in the way he was starting to recognize as her default armor. I'll have someone reach out. You can just give me your number, he said. I'm not complicated. She looked at him for a beat. Right. She took out her phone and he gave her his number and she texted him immediately so he'd have hers, and he looked at the contacts she'd created for herself in his phone. Victoria Hayes, Oliver's mom. He glanced up. She'd already turned and was walking back toward the car. He closed the bus door and continued the route. The coffee happened 10 days later. She'd texted, he'd responded, they'd found a time. He picked a place that was neutral ground, not somewhere that would feel like a date and not somewhere so deliberately casual that it made a statement of its own. A regular coffee shop on a weekday morning after his route ended and before her first meeting. She was already there when he arrived, which surprised him and then didn't surprise him. She seemed like someone who was constitutionally incapable of being late. She had a black coffee and she'd gotten him one too, which he could tell because there were 2 cups. He sat down across from her and picked it up. "I guessed black," she said. "Good guess. I'm usually good at reading people." She said it without particular pride, just as information. Occupational necessity. He drank the coffee. It was good. "So what do you want to know?" She wrapped her hands around her cup. Up close, without an event around her and without the context of the bus stop and the black SUV, she was, he noticed, again, in that same detached way. Remarkably striking. Not in a way that required effort to see. Just a fact, like the way a particular city block looks at a certain time of morning. He noticed it and moved on, because noticing things was not the same as doing anything about them. "What is he like?" she asked. "On the bus." "Quiet," Ethan said. "Obviously, but..." He thought about how to say it accurately. He pays attention to everything. He notices things the other kids don't. He watches people carefully, like he's doing the math on them before he commits to anything. She was watching him in exactly the way he was describing her son. He's been getting a little more open, I guess, is the word. He started sitting differently a couple months ago, more angled toward the aisle, not engaged, but not fully sealed off either. When did that start? Ethan thought about it. January, maybe? February? She did something quick with her eyes that he couldn't entirely interpret. He started sleeping better around then, first time in months. He didn't say anything to that. "The crackers," she said. "Tell me about the crackers," he told her. She listened with her coffee in both hands, and when he got to the part where Oliver had left them on his shoulder without saying anything and then looked at nothing, she looked at the table for a moment and her mouth pressed into a line. "He does that," she said, "at home. He'll just put things near you, a blanket if you seem cold, a glass of water. He doesn't say anything, he just does it." "Yeah," Ethan said, "that tracks." "He used to be..." She stopped. Her eyes went somewhere else briefly. "He was so loud. Before. He never stopped talking. He used to narrate everything. 'The dog is eating, Mama. The dog is eating so much. The dog is going to be fat.' Just constant." She exhaled. "It's been quiet for a very long time." He didn't try to fill the space she left. "I know he's getting better," she said, pulling herself back. "The therapist says the behavioral signs are consistent with gradual reconnection, the sleeping better, the positioning you described. These are good indicators." And then the gala. She paused. "I haven't let myself think too much about the gala." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because if I think too hard about it, I'm going to fall apart in a coffee shop, and I'm not going to do that." "Okay," he said. She appreciated that he didn't push. He could tell by the slight lowering of her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "The promise, the public thing, at the gala before..." He wasn't sure how to phrase this without it sounding like he was asking something he wasn't asking. "You said you'd marry whoever Oliver chose. Did you actually mean that, or was it..." "Deterrence," she said flatly. "Mostly deterrence. I've been dealing with men who see my net worth before they see my face since I was 26. She didn't say it with bitterness, just accuracy. Oliver's silence was something most people saw as a problem. I used it as a wall. That's pretty calculated. I'm a CEO. Calculated is the job. Then she paused, and something shifted. But I also meant it more than I intended to. He's the only person in my life who has never wanted anything from me. Ethan was quiet. My board wants performance. My investors want returns. My family... She stopped, adjusted. People have agendas. Oliver doesn't have an agenda. He just... She looked at her coffee. He just is. And whoever could earn his trust for real, without trying to engineer it, That person would be something different. And then he chose a school bus driver. She looked up at him. And then he chose a school bus driver. They sat with that for a moment. I'm not applying for the job, Ethan said. He said it clearly, because clarity seemed important. I want you to know that. I'm not here because of the promise or the video or anything like that. I'm here because you asked about your kid, and that's a reasonable thing to want to talk about. She held his gaze for a long moment, the assessing look, then, I know. Okay. I know, she said again, more quietly. That's actually why I felt okay asking. He looked at her for a second. Then he drank his coffee. They talked for another 40 minutes, about Oliver mostly, but not entirely. She asked about Maya in passing. You have a daughter, someone mentioned, and he told her about Maya's water cycle presentation, and the syrup, and the tablet he probably shouldn't have bought. And Victoria laughed again, that same real version of the laugh he'd first heard at the bus door. She told him reluctantly that she hadn't had a functional conversation about Oliver with another adult who actually knew him in months. The therapist was good but formal. The staff at home were careful. Her mother asked questions that were really just anxieties wearing the shape of questions. He was apparently easy to talk to. He didn't know what to do with that information except accept it as a logistical fact. When they were leaving, standing on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop with the morning going on around them, she said, I might want to do this again, if that's okay. He looked at her. The city light was direct on her face, and she was tired in a way she hadn't bothered to hide for the past 40 minutes. And she was Oliver's mother, and she was something else too, which he was aware of and was actively choosing not to act on. It's okay, he said. She nodded. Not warmly, not coolly, just with the straightforward acknowledgement of someone filing a piece of information into its correct place. Then she walked toward her car, which was parked half a block down. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. A woman walking a dog brushed past him. The light changed at the corner. Everything completely ordinary. He walked back to his truck. He drove home, changed out of the coffee clothes, made lunch, and started a load of laundry because it was that time of the week. He stood at the kitchen window while the machine ran and watched a sparrow doing something complex on the fire escape across the alley. He thought about what Victoria had said about Oliver being the only person in her life who never wanted anything from her. He thought about how she'd said it, not with self-pity, but with this quiet exhaustion, like she'd been carrying the weight of being wanted from for so long she'd stopped noticing it as a weight and had just reclassified it as gravity. He understood that, in a different key. After Cassandra, after the divorce, after the years of rebuilding a life that fit within the actual limits of what he was, he'd stopped looking for someone to make him feel like more than he was. He'd made peace with exactly what he was. Bus driver, dad, man who was early to things and bad at ignoring what was in front of him. He didn't know what he was doing here, in whatever here was. He wasn't doing anything, technically. He'd had coffee with a woman because she wanted to talk about her son. That was a completely ordinary thing. People did that. He turned away from the window and went to fold the laundry, which was the most effective way he knew to stop thinking about something. On the bus the following Monday, Oliver got on at 7:14 and sat in his usual seat. Halfway through the route, at the intersection near the park where Ethan usually hit a long light, Oliver reached into his backpack and produced something. He held it for a moment. Then he leaned forward and placed it on the little console tray near the driver's seat, the same place he'd left the crackers back in December. It was a drawing, paper folded in quarters, slightly wrinkled, crayon. When Ethan unfolded it at the next red light, it showed two figures, one tall, one small, standing next to something that was either a yellow bus or a rectangular sun. Both figures had large, round heads. The tall one appeared to be wearing something on its head, possibly a hat, though Ethan didn't wear hats and never had. At the bottom, in the careful, oversized letters of a first grader, ETHN, OLIV. He held the drawing for the length of the red light. Then the light changed and he had a route to finish, so he carefully refolded it and set it on the tray and drove. When he got to the depot that afternoon, he took it out and looked at it again. The spelling, the two figures, the bus or sun shape, The complete absence of any concern for proportion or accuracy that made it somehow more honest than a better drawing would have been. He kept it. He folded it and put it in his wallet, which was where things went when they mattered. He didn't tell anyone about the drawing. Some things don't need an audience. The drawing stayed in his wallet for 3 weeks before Maya found it. She wasn't snooping. She'd needed bus fare, and he'd handed her the wallet without thinking, and when she opened it, the folded paper fell out onto the kitchen table. She picked it up before he could say anything, unfolded it with the automatic curiosity of an 8-year-old encountering an unknown object, and studied it for a long moment. ETHN, she read aloud. He's 6, Ethan said. Spelling is approximate. Maya looked at the drawing for another few seconds. The 2 stick figures, the round heads, the bus or sun shape that defied geometric categorization. Then she very carefully refolded it and set it back on the table. He drew you a picture, she said. He did. And you kept it in your wallet. Ethan took the wallet back and put it in his pocket. Did you get the bus fare? Dad. Maya. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, not like a child, but like someone older living temporarily in a child's body, waiting for him to catch up. That's a big deal, she said, for a kid who doesn't talk to people, drawing someone a picture. That's a lot. I know, he said. Are you going to tell his mom? He hadn't decided yet. Maybe. I don't know. Maya took her bus fare from his hand and her backpack from the floor and was out the door in the next 30 seconds, which was how she operated when she'd made her point, efficiently, without ceremony, leaving the point to sit in the room on its own. He did tell Victoria. The following Tuesday, in the same coffee shop, which had by then started to feel like a neutral territory they'd established by unspoken agreement. He showed her the photo he'd taken of it before refolding it, because it seemed like the kind of thing a mother should see. She looked at her phone screen for a long time. He hasn't drawn people since his dad died, she said. Ethan didn't say anything. He used to draw our family constantly. Me, James, him, the dog we had, Biscuit, who was completely useless as a dog and mostly just sat on things. She paused. After the accident, he stopped. His therapist mentioned it a few times. She handed the phone back to Ethan. Her hand was steady. He drew you a picture. He spelled my name wrong. He's 6. That's what I said. She looked at her coffee. Something in her face was doing the thing he'd started to recognize. The private processing that happened just beneath the composed surface. Whatever she actually felt being sorted and filed before any of it reached the outside. She'd gotten good at it over what he assumed were years of having to be composed in rooms full of people who were watching her. He's been talking more, she said. At home. Small things. He asked Mrs. Kim for more rice at dinner last week. He told me his shoe was wet. She looked up. He told me, out loud, not a full conversation, but he said a sentence and waited for me to respond and then nodded when I did. That's good, Ethan said. It's the most normal thing that's happened in 2 years. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened around the coffee cup. It's a completely ordinary sentence, and it nearly made me cry in the kitchen. Nothing ordinary about it, he said. She looked at him. No, I guess not. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city went about its regular business. A delivery truck double-parked, 2 people arguing pleasantly over something at a food cart, a woman walking fast with her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. His therapist wants to try group sessions, Victoria said. Other kids who've been through grief and trauma. She thinks Oliver might respond to seeing other children who've had a hard time and come through it. She paused. He has to want to try it, though. And wanting things out loud is it's still new. Has he said anything about it? I asked him last night. He looked at me for a long time. Then he went back to his book. She made a small sound, which is either a no or a processing pause that will result in an answer in approximately 3 to 5 business days. Ethan laughed at that. Not a polite laugh. An actual one, quick and surprised. She looked at him for a second and then she smiled too. And it was the most unguarded he'd seen her. Something the previous version of the smile, the public one, had been a reasonable facsimile of, but this one used different muscles. He looked back at his coffee. I'm going to suggest he try it, she said, back to practical. The group session. I think the fact that he said something at the gala, that he has an experience of doing a hard thing and having it go okay, that might make it slightly less impossible. Probably. His therapist also said, she stopped. Something shifted in how she was holding herself. She said the key variable in his improvement seems to be a consistent, non-pressuring male presence in his daily routine. She looked at Ethan with an expression that was being very careful about itself. She asked if I knew who that might be. The sentence landed precisely where she'd aimed it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her about you, the bus, that you've been on his route since October, and that you don't seem to push, that you just show up and let him be whatever he is that morning. He nodded slowly. Okay. She asked if there might be any opportunity for Oliver to spend time in that environment outside of the bus, a setting where he's around you but it's still low pressure, no expectations. He understood what was being asked. He also understood that it was being asked very carefully, with a layer of clinical framing that was partly genuine and partly giving them both somewhere to stand that wasn't too close to something else. I take Maya to the park on Saturday mornings, he said, Ridgeline Park, near the reservoir. We throw a frisbee very badly and walk around and usually end up at the food truck that does breakfast burritos. He paused. If Oliver wanted to come, that would be fine. It's not structured, it's just a morning. Victoria looked at him. She stopped. Are you sure? I don't want to. I just said it was fine, he said. I mean it. If he comes, he comes. If he doesn't want to, he doesn't. No obligation. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. I'll ask him. She asked him that evening, apparently, and reported back via text the following day. He didn't say no, which in Oliver language might be a yes. Is Saturday at 10 okay? Ethan replied, works. She replied, thank you. He looked at the text for a second, then put his phone in his pocket and finished the laundry he was doing. Saturday was gray and slightly windy, the kind of morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to be spring or wanted one more round of winter, and Ethan stood near the reservoir with Maya throwing a frisbee that veered dramatically to the left on every throw regardless of how they adjusted their aim. This was a known issue with the frisbee. They had not replaced it because Maya had named it Gerald and become attached. Gerald's going in the lake, Maya announced, watching Ethan's throw arc sideways into a bush. Gerald is a structural problem, Ethan said, retrieving it. He saw them arrive at the park entrance. Victoria was in jeans and a coat that was still nicer than most people's nice coats, but was the most casual he'd seen her. Less armor, more person. Oliver was beside her in a red jacket, hands in his pockets, looking at the park like he was deciding something. Maya spotted them at the same moment. Is that? She looked at Ethan. Is that Oliver? His mom and I talked. Thought maybe he'd want to come. Maya processed this in about half a second. Then she did what Maya did, which was make a decision and act on it before the decision could get complicated. She walked directly toward them, Gerald hanging from her hand. Hi, she said to Oliver. I'm Maya. This is Gerald. He's bad at frisbee. Do you want to try? Oliver looked at her, then at Gerald, then at Ethan, who was approaching from a few steps behind. Oliver looked back at the frisbee. He held out his hand. Maya handed it over without ceremony. Oliver examined it the way he examined most things, with a careful, quiet attention that missed nothing. He turned it over, looked at the slight warp in the rim that was responsible for Gerald's navigational issues. Then he pulled his arm back and threw it. It went straight. Not a long throw, maybe 15 feet, but straight as an arrow. Maya stared at it. How did you do that? Oliver looked at her expression, and something moved briefly across his face. Not quite pride, but its shy cousin. It's the wrist, Ethan said, coming alongside them. You have to roll the wrist on the release, compensates for the warp. He glanced at Oliver. Good eye. Oliver looked at him, looked at the frisbee, which Maya had already retrieved, and was now attempting the same throw with significantly less success. The morning went the way mornings sometimes did when you stopped engineering them, which was messily and unevenly and mostly fine. Maya attempted the wrist technique 30 times with incrementally better results. narrating each throw with commentary that managed to be both scientific and completely unhinged. Oliver stood near Ethan and watched, and occasionally accepted the frisbee when it was handed to him and threw it straight every time, which both delighted and frustrated Maya in equal measure. Victoria sat on a bench a few yards away and watched all of it. Ethan was aware of her presence without looking at her constantly, aware the way you're aware of a lamp in the corner of a room, an ambient light that changes the quality of the space. At some point, he glanced over and found her watching Oliver specifically, her son, throwing a frisbee in a park on a Saturday morning. Her face had let something down that she usually kept up, and what was underneath it wasn't sadness exactly. It was something more complex, more relieved, like she'd been holding her breath for a very long time and had finally let a little of it out. He looked away before she caught him watching. Around 11:30, Maya made the executive decision that burritos were required, and she directed this pronouncement at Oliver with the seriousness of someone announcing policy. "The truck does chicken, and there's a veggie one, but the veggie one has weird peppers," she said. "What do you like?" Oliver considered. Then he held up one finger. "Chicken?" Maya said. He nodded. "Correct answer," she said. "Come on." She started toward the food truck. Oliver stood for a second, glanced at Ethan, and then followed her. Ethan watched them go, the 8-year-old talking and the 6-year-old beside her, not talking, but there, actually there, his red jacket visible through the knot of other parkgoers between them and the truck. "She's remarkable," Victoria said. He'd almost forgotten she was close enough to hear. He turned. She was standing now a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets. "She is," he agreed. She just walked up to him. No hesitation, no special voice, no... She shook her head. Most adults put on a whole performance when they meet Oliver. The careful voice, the special effort. She just talked to him like he was there. "She grew up watching me do the same," he said, and then felt slightly uncomfortable with how much that said about the previous months. So he added, "On the bus, in general. She's seen me deal with a lot of different kids." Victoria let that go gracefully. He answered her, the finger. He pointed. "He communicates. He always has. He just chooses his method." She looked toward the food truck, where they could see the top of Oliver's red jacket. "His therapist would say that's an adaptive coping mechanism, finding alternative communication pathways." She paused. "I just think he figured out the rules of a game nobody taught him and learned to play it anyway." Ethan looked at her. "That's better than what the therapist said." She almost smiled. "Don't tell her that." They walked toward the food truck together, and it was unremarkable, the walking together, except that it wasn't, and they both knew it. The burritos were good. Maya ate hers with a complete lack of regard for the structural integrity of its wrapping and wound up with half of it on the bench beside her, which she ate piece by piece while conducting what appeared to be a one-sided but entirely animated conversation with Oliver about something involving a video game she played. Oliver sat beside her and ate his burrito neatly and listened and occasionally nodded or shook his head at the moments that seemed to require a response. Victoria sat across from them and ate and watched and said very little. Ethan ate his burrito and watched all three of them and said very little also. It was, he thought, probably the most normal morning any of them had had in a while. Imperfect and uncoordinated and normal, which was not the same as unremarkable but was its own kind of good. They parted ways in the parking area at the edge of the park. Maya told Oliver he could have Gerald if he wanted, because she'd decided that Gerald would perform better for someone with proper wrist mechanics, and Oliver looked at the frisbee for a moment and then, very deliberately, took it. Maya looked extremely satisfied. Oliver walked beside his mother toward the car. Partway there, he stopped and turned back. He looked at Ethan, standing by the truck. He raised one hand, a small wave, deliberate, specifically for Ethan. Ethan raised his back. Oliver turned and got in the car. Maya appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Can we do that again?" she said. "Probably," he said. "Cool." She looked at the car pulling out of the lot. "His mom is really pretty." Maya. "I'm just saying, it's not a crime to say that. You didn't go blind after the divorce." "Please get in the truck." She got in the truck, but she was smiling. He got in on his side and sat for a second with his hands on the wheel. Then he started the engine and pulled out. The Saturdays became a thing. Not every week, not structured. Victoria texted occasionally, and Ethan replied, and sometimes it worked out, and sometimes it didn't. But over the next month, there were 4 of them. The park again, once. A farmer's market where Maya found a stall selling handmade marbles, and spent 20 minutes in deep price negotiation with a woman in her 70s who was, by all appearances, enjoying it tremendously. Once just a walk along the river path that the city had built, and then neglected slightly, with its cracked pavement and optimistic signage. Oliver didn't talk at any of these, not in words, but he walked beside Maya more often than not, and once, at the farmer's market, when a dog came hurtling toward them, trailing a leash and no discernible owner, Oliver put himself between the dog and Maya without being asked, which made Maya say hey in a surprised tone and then look at him differently for the rest of the morning. Ethan noticed. He noticed Oliver's geometry in a crowd, how the boy placed himself, where he chose to stand, who he stayed close to. On the bus, it had always been isolation, the strategic seat, the folded hands, the careful distance from everything. On these mornings, the geometry was different. He moved toward things, carefully, slowly, without fanfare, but toward. Victoria noticed too. He could tell by the way she watched Oliver, with this precise, recalibrated attention, like she was constantly updating an internal document. Not anxious watching, something more like witnessing, which was different. They talked more on these mornings. Not about Oliver the whole time. That had been the entry point, but it wasn't the only room anymore. She talked about her company in a way that was different from how she talked about it publicly. Not the performance of competence, but the actual texture of it, the grinding parts, the decisions that didn't have clean answers. A VP who was excellent at his job and terrible to the people below him, and the particular exhaustion of managing someone who was right about everything and wrong about the way he was right about it. "You keep him?" Ethan asked. "For now. It's more complicated than—" She sighed. "He knows things I can't afford to lose, and I'm working on the rest. It's like, you ever had a car that runs perfectly but the heat doesn't work?" "Currently," Ethan said, which made her laugh. She told him about her parents, her mother specifically, who called twice a week and asked about Oliver in a way that was more about Victoria's management of the situation than Oliver himself. "Have you tried the new therapist someone recommended? Have you looked into that school in Connecticut? Have you considered that maybe you work too much?" The endless inventory of what she could be doing differently. "And you say?" "I say we're fine." "Which we are. Mostly." She looked across the river. "It's different from being told we're fine and believing we're fine, but she doesn't ask for that distinction." "My ex-wife's mother used to do that," he said. "The question that's not actually a question." Victoria looked at him. This was, he realized, the first time he'd mentioned Cassandra. "What happened?" she asked. Then immediately, "You don't have to. We just didn't work," he said. "I don't mean that as a euphemism. I mean we were genuinely not compatible in ways that took us 4 years to understand. She's a good person. She's a good mother. We were bad at being married to each other." "Is it difficult, the shared custody?" He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes. The handoffs are weird when one of us is in a bad place about something unrelated to Maya. And there's always this thing where you have to trust that the other person is doing okay with her when you can't see it. That part doesn't get easier." He paused. "But we were better at splitting up than we were at staying together, which is not a thing I thought I'd ever say." Victoria nodded slowly. "James and I were good at being married," she said, "which is the other kind of complicated." He let that sit. You spend 2 years trying to grieve someone and also not disappear into the grief because you have a 4-year-old who needs you to be present, and then at some point you realize you don't know what's left when you take both of those things out. The grief and the managing of it. There's a lot of silence in the middle. She paused. "Oliver and I had that in common, I suppose." "You both stopped talking." "Mine was more—" She made a vague gesture. "Talking became the performance. I still said plenty of words. I just stopped saying anything in them." She glanced at him. "That probably sounds dramatic." "No, it doesn't." She studied him for a moment. "You're very easy to say things to. It's slightly inconvenient." He understood what she meant and chose not to respond to it directly. It's a bus driver skill, he said. Lots of time at red lights. She shook her head slightly, and the conversation moved on, and the morning continued. The thing that happened in late June was not something either of them had planned. It was after a Saturday at the park. A good one. Warm, finally. The kind of day where the city remembers it's capable of being pleasant. And they'd been walking back toward the parking area when Maya stepped directly into a hole in the cracked pavement that she'd previously successfully avoided and turned her ankle. Not badly. Not broken. Nothing dramatic. But enough that she went down to one knee with a sharp sound and then sat on the ground holding her foot with watering eyes, performing with genuine dignity the task of not actually crying. I'm fine, she said. I'm fine, I'm fine. She was not fine. She was very embarrassed and in moderate pain and 8 years old, which was a particular combination. Ethan was beside her immediately. He checked the ankle with hands that knew what they were looking for because he'd coached Maya's soccer team for 2 seasons, and ankle injuries were an occupational familiarity. Nothing structural. He told her so. She told him she knew that, she was fine. Could he please stop touching it with the face he was making? Oliver, who had been walking a few feet ahead, had turned at the sound. He stood looking at Maya on the ground. Then he walked over, which Ethan noticed at the corner of his eye while still checking the ankle. Oliver sat down beside Maya on the cracked pavement without any ceremony, cross-legged, and just sat there. Not doing anything, just there. Maya looked at him sideways. Her eyes were still watery. I'm fine, she said, this time in the tone of someone reporting a fact to a peer rather than defending herself to an adult. Oliver sat there. It just surprised me, she said. He sat there. Gerald would have been useful, she said. Like, if I'd had Gerald, I would have been looking at Gerald, and I wouldn't have stepped in the... She stopped because she was starting to smile despite herself. That doesn't make any sense. Oliver looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. She started laughing then, the way you do when you're embarrassed and slightly hurt, and someone just looks at you right. The laugh broke the thing she'd been holding, and she put her hand over her face and laughed, and Oliver sat next to her on the pavement and did not laugh, but looked like he understood every part of why she was. Victoria was standing just behind Ethan. He became aware of a sound from her direction. Small, controlled, the kind of sound that happens when you prevent something larger. He straightened up and turned, and she was looking at her son, both hands at her mouth, her eyes doing everything they'd done at the gala. That same flooded quality, too many things at once. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. Oliver had just sat with someone who was hurting. He'd chosen to, without being told, without instruction, without any performance of helpfulness. He'd just gone and been beside her because she needed someone to be beside her. The boy who'd sat alone on the bus with his hands folded on his backpack, sealed off from everything, for months. That boy had just gone and sat on cracked pavement next to an 8-year-old girl and stayed there until she felt better. Victoria pressed her hands against her mouth and looked at the sky for a second, and did a very hard thing, which was hold herself together when part of her had every right to fall apart. Ethan stood beside her without doing anything except being there, which seemed to be the thing she needed, and was, he noticed, more or less what Oliver had just done for Maya. Maybe Oliver came by it honestly. Maya hobbled to the truck with help, Oliver walking beside her and carrying her bag without being asked. Maya was already fully recovered in the way of children, narrating the story of her ankle injury to Oliver as they walked as if he hadn't been standing there when it happened. Oliver listened attentively to the account. Victoria drove alongside in the car for the short distance to Ethan's truck, and before she pulled away, she rolled down her window. "Thank you," she said, which she'd said before, on that first morning at the bus stop, and it had meant something different then. "Your kid did the thing," he said. "I just stood there." She shook her head, which he took to mean that wasn't what she was thanking him for, and he didn't push it. She pulled away. He got Maya into the truck, got her foot up on the dash with a bag of fries from a drive-thru as a therapeutic ice pack substitute, which Maya accepted on the grounds that it was close enough, and drove home. They'd been back maybe 20 minutes when his phone buzzed. It was Victoria. Not a long text, just, Oliver asked if Maya was okay. He looked at it. 3 words and what they meant. A kid who hadn't asked about people out loud in 2 years asking about a person. He typed back, "Tell him she's fine." Gerald survived the fall. A pause. Then, he smiled at that. Another pause. Then, so did I. He set the phone down. Maya was on the couch with her foot elevated on a pillow, watching something on her tablet and already fine, the way she was always fine after she'd had the chance to feel what she felt and move on. Outside the window, the Saturday afternoon was doing what it usually did, cooling as the light changed, the neighborhood reassembling itself toward evening. The guy upstairs was cooking something that involved garlic. A kid was riding a bike in circles in the parking lot. Somewhere down the block a radio was on. He sat on the couch beside Maya, and she put her feet on his lap without looking up from her screen, and he didn't move them. What was happening? Whatever this was, whatever had been building since October in increments too small to name individually, but too consistent to ignore, had started to have a shape. Not a completed one. Not a shape with clean edges and a clear outline. More like when you're looking at a photograph that's still developing, the image emerging from nothing gradually. And you can see enough to know what it is, but not yet all of what it will be. He knew what he was feeling. He was 32, not 17, and he'd felt things before and knew how to identify them. He knew that he thought about Victoria between the times he saw her, and not just incidentally. He knew that the mornings in the park had become things he looked forward to in a way that was specifically about her, and not only about Oliver. He knew that she laughed differently with him than she appeared to laugh anywhere else, and that he was aware of this in a way that meant something. He also knew that he had no intention of doing anything about it, for a collection of reasons that were all real. She was Oliver's mother. He was Oliver's bus driver. Whatever had developed between Oliver and him was fragile and specific, and built on the absence of agenda, and the moment he introduced one, the moment this became about anything other than what it was, the whole careful architecture of it could come down. And beyond that, he didn't know what she felt. He had guesses. He wasn't oblivious, but guesses weren't enough, and asking wasn't something he was ready to do. So he sat with it, quietly. The way Oliver had learned to sit with things, present, attentive, not forcing anything. He was aware at some level that this was either very wise or very avoidant, and that the line between those two things was thinner than he liked. Maya reached over without looking up and patted his arm. "You went quiet," she said. "Just thinking." "Okay." She went back to her screen. "The burrito truck was good today." "Yeah," he said. It was. He looked at the window and the light changing in it, and left everything he was thinking right where it was. The following Monday, Oliver got on the bus at Wren Street. He was carrying Gerald. Ethan opened the door and Oliver came up the steps, and he was holding the frisbee against his chest the way kids hold things they've decided matter. "Morning," Ethan said. Oliver stopped. He looked at Ethan directly, then quietly. Quietly enough that none of the other kids heard it. Just the two of them in the space between the step and the driver's seat. "Morning." One word, small and clear and certain. Ethan felt it land somewhere below the breastbone. "Good morning," he said back, and kept his voice exactly even, because Oliver did not need a production. He just needed it to be received. Oliver walked to his seat and sat down and put his hands on his backpack. And the bus route continued, and outside the windows the city moved through itself in its usual indifferent way. And Ethan drove. He drove the whole route with that one word sitting in the center of him like something warm. Morning, 2 syllables, 7 months in the making. He kept them where they were and kept driving. He didn't tell Victoria about the morning right away. He wasn't sure why, exactly. It wasn't strategic. He didn't have a strategy. It was more that the moment felt like Oliver's, privately, and broadcasting it immediately felt like doing to Oliver what Ethan had refused to let the ballroom do, making a production of a thing that was simply, cleanly true. So he held it for a few days, turned it over in his head the way you turn a good sentence over, not because you want to change it, but because you want to understand exactly why it works. Oliver said morning again on Wednesday. Same quiet tone, same directness, same absence of ceremony. Like it had always been something he did and he was just returning to the habit. Ethan said it back. Oliver sat down. The route continued. By Friday, it was established, not announced, not celebrated, just a small daily exchange that lived in the 6 inches of space between the bus door and the driver's seat. One word in, one word back. The whole thing took 4 seconds. He texted Victoria on Saturday morning. He's been saying good morning to me this week, every day. She replied 11 minutes later, which was the longest he'd ever waited for a response from her. He'd noticed she was fast at text, the kind of person whose phone was always somewhere close. 11 minutes meant she was doing something with the information before she replied to it. Every day? Every day. Another pause, shorter. His therapist is going to lose her mind. In a good way. Tell her when you're ready, didn't want to make it a bigger thing than it was. It's a big thing, she replied. And then, after a beat, thank you for treating it like it wasn't. He understood the distinction. He put his phone down and finished his coffee. The summer moved in the way summers do when you're not measuring them against much. Slowly and then suddenly, the days long and specific and then gone. The school year ended in mid-June, which meant Oliver was off the bus route until September, which meant the mornings at Wren Street stopped, and Ethan became more aware than he'd expected of their absence. The route without Oliver was the route it had been in September before Oliver. All the same kids, same stops, same timing. Nothing was different. He kept telling himself that. He and Victoria kept the Saturdays mostly intact through July. Not every week. She had business things, travel, the particular demands of a company that didn't stop moving because the school calendar did, but often enough that it had become a recognizable pattern in his week. The way the route was a recognizable pattern. Things you built your time around without having made a formal decision to. They'd moved locations. Less of the park by July because the summer crowds made it loud and Maya had declared it too chaotic, which was a remarkable statement from a person who'd once narrated a 40-minute frisbee session without pause. They'd started meeting at a quieter spot along the river trail, a stretch that wasn't heavily trafficked, where Oliver liked to look at the water and Maya liked to find the worst possible throwing rocks and attempt distance records. Oliver was talking more. Not in torrents. Nothing like the constant narration Victoria had described from before, but in sentences sometimes. Short ones, carefully deployed. He told Maya once that her rock-throwing technique was inefficient, which she found genuinely offensive, and which started a 20-minute technical discussion that Oliver participated in with a precision that was completely at odds with his age. He asked Ethan once if the bus had a name, and when Ethan said no, Oliver looked at this piece of information for a moment and then said, with complete seriousness, it should have one. Ethan had thought about it for the rest of the day. He still hadn't come up with a name. Maya had 3 suggestions by the following Saturday, all rejected by Oliver on grounds he stated quietly and specifically. Ethan stayed out of the debate, but privately thought Oliver's aesthetic instincts were correct. What he couldn't stay out of, or couldn't stay out of indefinitely, was the thing between him and Victoria that had been growing with the same quiet consistency as everything else in this unlikely arrangement. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about it. In another story, or told by someone who needed the shape of drama to make sense of feeling, there would have been a moment, a charged look, a near kiss, some tilted axis you could point to. There wasn't one of those. There was instead a long accumulation of ordinary moments that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. The way she handed him a coffee without asking how he took it because she knew. The way she said his name when she was making a point. Not Mr. Carter, just Ethan, quiet and direct, like the word was something she'd decided was hers to use. The way she'd started touching his arm sometimes when she laughed. Not deliberately. Just the physical reflex of a person who'd found someone funny and let her body say so before her composure could intervene. The way he watched for her car in the parking area before he could stop himself. He knew. He'd known for a while. He just hadn't done anything about it because knowing wasn't sufficient, and the reasons for caution were still real. Oliver, the route, the architecture of what they'd built. All of that still stood. And then there was the other thing. The thing he'd been aware of since February, since the video went places, since people had started treating Victoria Hayes' love life like public infrastructure. The men hadn't stopped. That was the reality he'd been observing from his particular vantage point for months. The ballroom hadn't ended the competition. If anything, the video had clarified the rules, and some people had decided that the new play was to pursue a friendship with Ethan Carter specifically, which was its own kind of thing to witness. Two of them had introduced themselves to him. Once at a school event he'd attended as a driver representative in April. Once at the coffee shop, where a man named Derek, tall, suited, the kind of handsome that was maintained with considerable effort, had apparently recognized him from the video and stopped at their table. "This is the guy," Derek had said to Victoria, with the forced, casual warmth of someone performing something. "The famous bus driver." He'd shaken Ethan's hand with too much grip and laughed too easily at something that hadn't been a joke. Victoria had been polite and brief, and Derek had moved on, but she'd been quieter than usual for a few minutes after. "Happens a lot?" Ethan had asked. "Often enough?" She'd looked at her cup. "Some of them have started trying to—" She'd stopped, seemed to decide something, continued. "They've started treating you like a benchmark. Like the thing they need to clear is figuring out how you got Oliver to respond to you and then replicating it. You can't replicate it. I know that. Because the reason Oliver responded is that I wasn't trying to get Oliver to respond." "I know," she said again. "But you can't explain that to people who fundamentally don't understand the difference between strategy and sincerity." He'd sat with that. "Does it bother you? The field of people?" She'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. "Which part are you asking about?" He hadn't been sure, honestly. So he'd let it go, and the conversation had moved on, and he'd driven home afterward with the question still sitting unanswered somewhere in the space between what he was willing to say and what he wasn't. The thing that pushed him, eventually, was not a dramatic event. It was a Tuesday evening in late July. He'd finished the charter route he was picking up for summer income and was in the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in the truck with a bag of food going warm beside him, doing nothing in particular, when his phone buzzed. Not Victoria. Frank. "Saw you on that celebrity gossip thing again," Frank texted. "They're saying the CEO's dating a venture capital guy. Some article." Ethan stared at the text for a moment. Then he put the phone down. Then he picked it back up. He did not search for the article. He drove home, made dinner, helped Maya with a summer reading project she'd been avoiding with considerable creativity, watched half of something on television without registering what it was. He went to bed at his regular time and lay in the dark and listened to the neighbor's TV through the wall and thought about the fact that the piece of information Frank had texted him had produced a reaction in him that was unmistakable. He was bothered by it, not in a dramatic, urgent, cinematic way. Just bothered. A persistent low discomfort that he recognized as the kind of feeling that lived in the difference between what you'd been telling yourself you wanted and what you actually wanted. He'd been telling himself he was being careful, that he was protecting Oliver and protecting the arrangement and not inserting himself where he didn't belong. All of which was true, as far as it went. But it went only so far, and beyond it was a simpler truth that he'd been navigating around for months. He didn't want Victoria Hayes to be dating a venture capital person. He didn't want her to be dating anyone. He wanted, in a specific and honest way that he'd been declining to name, to be the person she was with. He lay in the dark and acknowledged this because he was 32 years old and had been through enough to know that not acknowledging things didn't make them smaller. Then he went to sleep because acknowledging something and acting on it were different categories of decision, and one night wasn't enough to figure out the second one. He texted Victoria the next morning. "Is Saturday still working for you?" She replied quickly, normal speed. "Actually, could we do something different? Oliver has a thing with his therapist in the morning. I was thinking maybe just us, if you're free. There's a thing downtown I've been wanting to try." He looked at the text. Just us was not a large phrase. It was 2 words. Ooh. It was also the first time she'd suggested anything that didn't include the children. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "Sure," he replied. "What time?" She picked a place on a street he didn't know well, in the part of the city that had been renovated recently and had that particular quality of places that were trying to be somewhere worth going. A wine bar that apparently also did lunch, which he looked up on his phone and quickly established was expensive in the quiet way of places that didn't put the prices on the outside. He told Frank about it, because Frank was the person he told things to when he needed to say them out loud to organize them. They were in Frank's driveway on Thursday evening, Frank working on his car, and Ethan handing him tools, which was a dynamic that had been in place since they were both 24 and had not fundamentally changed. "So it's a date," Frank said. "I don't know what it is." She said, "Just us." "People say just us about things that aren't dates." Frank looked at him over the hood of the car. "What people?" Ethan handed him a wrench. "I don't know what she means by it." "Then maybe you could ask her." "I'm not going to ask her." "Why?" "Because we haven't. There's a whole thing. Oliver, the bus, all of it. I can't just—" "Ethan." Frank said it with the patience of a man who had known him for a decade and had watched him navigate his own feelings with the directness of someone diffusing a bomb one wire at a time. "You like this woman?" "Yes." "She asked you to lunch, just the two of you?" "Yes." "So go to lunch, see what happens. You don't have to propose marriage at the soup course." "There might not be soup." "You know what I mean." Ethan looked at the car. "What if it messes things up with Oliver?" Frank was quiet for a moment, which meant he was taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it. "You've been good for that kid," he said finally, "and from what you've told me, the kid's mother knows that. So either she's smart enough to think this through or she's not, and you find that out now rather than later." He paused. "But you've been standing 6 feet away from something for 6 months. At some point, you got to actually move." Ethan didn't say anything. "You're not going to break the kid by having lunch with his mom," Frank said. "You've been careful. You keep being careful. But careful can become its own kind of problem if you do it past the point it's useful." He thought about that for the drive home. The lunch was on Saturday at noon. He wore his own suit this time, not Frank's, which meant it fit correctly and didn't make a statement. He was early because he was always early, and he sat at the table and looked at the wine list without seeing it. Victoria arrived 4 minutes later. She was wearing something that occupied the space between professional and personal. A silk blouse, dark trousers, her hair down. She looked, as she sat across from him, like someone who'd also thought about what this was before arriving. "Hi," she said. "Hi." The waiter came. They ordered. Small talk moved through the space between them the way it did when two people were working their way toward something that neither had named yet. She asked about Maya's summer. He asked about Oliver's therapy session. She said it had gone well. The group sessions had started, and Oliver was mostly observing rather than participating. But observing was its own form of presence, and the therapist was pleased with it. "He asked me last week who you were," she said. Ethan looked at her. "What do you mean? He knows who I am." "I mean, he asked, in more words than usual. He asked what you are to us." She looked at the table. He said it directly. He said, "What is Ethan?" The sentence moved through him in a way he didn't have an immediate vocabulary for. "What did you tell him?" he asked. "I told him you were our friend." She looked up, and then I sat with whether that was the whole truth. The table between them was very still. Around them, the restaurant was doing its lunch business. Other conversations, someone's birthday at the table across the room, the clean sound of good glassware. "Victoria," he started. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what this is," she said. Not dramatically, just clearly, like someone who'd decided the cleanest path through a complicated thing was to say it plainly. "I've been careful about it because of Oliver, and because of the video and the promise and all of it. I didn't want to be that person, the one who manufactured a romantic narrative out of something that belonged to my son." "You're not that person," he said. "I know I'm not, but I needed to be sure of the difference." She looked at him steadily. "Between what Oliver feels about you and what I feel about you. They're related, but they're not the same thing, and I needed them to not be confused in my head before I said anything." He was quiet for a moment. "And are they? Not confused?" "As much as they can be," she exhaled. "He needed something from you that I can't provide, and I need something different from what Oliver needs, something that has nothing to do with him." She paused. "Though having a person who loves my kid before loving me is—" She stopped. "That's not a small thing." "It's not," he agreed, "but it can't be the whole thing either. I'm not looking for a parent for Oliver. I'm looking for—" She didn't finish. "I know," he said. They looked at each other. "I've been standing still on purpose," he said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't, I wasn't oblivious. I was making a choice. I know that too. The corner of her mouth moved. It was slightly maddening. Yeah? The cracker story. You talked about the crackers for 10 minutes and I sat across from you and you had no idea. She stopped. Never mind. He almost smiled. I had some idea. She looked at him. How much idea? Enough that I kept Frank's suit after the gala. I had the dry cleaning bill and everything. I just didn't return it for 3 weeks. She studied him. That's your version of a declaration? I'm working on it. She laughed then. The real version, the one that came out before composure could get there. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then she composed herself again. But the 3 seconds had happened, and he'd seen them. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, I don't know what word we're using. Let's try something. Let's see what this is, done honestly, without the video or the promise or any of the rest of it. She looked at him with the clear, direct precision he'd come to understand was her baseline. Can you do that? Yes, he said, simply. She nodded. Something settled in her shoulders. Not relaxation exactly, more like a decision that had been in motion had finally landed. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I should tell you that. I don't need easy. I work a lot. I have opinions about things that people find exhausting. I have an ex-husband who's gone, and a son who's still finding his way back, and a board of directors who would find the concept of this very interesting in the wrong direction. I drive a school bus, he said. I'm going to need a longer suit. She looked at him for a moment. That's all you have to say? What else do you want me to say? You told me true things about yourself. Those are the same things I've already seen. I don't know what the problem is. She opened her mouth and then closed it, looked at the table. You're kind of infuriating. Frank says the same thing. The food arrived, which gave them both somewhere to look for a moment. The conversation shifted, not to avoid what had been said, but because it had been said and that was enough. And there was food and a Saturday afternoon and nothing that needed to be fixed in the next 10 minutes. They ate and talked, and the afternoon did its thing around them. And Ethan found himself thinking, somewhere in the middle of it, that this was what it felt like when something stopped being complicated. Not simple. Nothing about this was simple, but no longer requiring the constant management of distance. He walked her to her car after. The street was warm, the light that particular gold of mid-afternoon in summer that made everything look like it was worth something. She stopped at the driver's door, turned to look at him. He kissed her. Not because the moment called for it cinematically, but because they'd talked around it long enough and he was done talking around it, and she kissed him back in the direct, unhesitating way she did most things, which shouldn't have surprised him and did anyway. It lasted a few seconds. Then they were standing on a city sidewalk in the afternoon, and the rest of the street continued around them. Okay, she said again, quietly. Okay, he said. She got in her car. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her pull out, and then he turned and walked back to his truck. Frank called 20 minutes later, apparently operating on some kind of frequency. How'd it go? Fine, Ethan said. A pause. Define fine. Good. It went good. Another pause. Are you smiling? Drive your own car, Frank. Frank made a sound of complete satisfaction. Knew it. Pay up, Linda, he said, apparently to his wife, who could be heard in the background making a sound of mock disappointment. You bet on me? Small amount. Look, I believed in you. Goodbye, Frank. Good for you, man. Genuinely. He hung up. He sat in the truck for a moment. The street outside was doing its regular Saturday afternoon business. He put both hands on the wheel. He thought about Oliver asking, "What is Ethan?" The question, unanswered. A 6-year-old's version of the thing he and Victoria had been circling for months, asked plainly because Oliver did most things plainly when he chose to do them at all. What is Ethan? A friend, Victoria had said. And then she'd sat with whether that was the whole truth. He was still working out what the whole truth was, but he'd moved toward it today, which was more than he'd done in 6 months, and it felt like the right direction. His phone buzzed. Victoria. Oliver just asked me if you're coming to the park on Saturday. He read it twice. What did you tell him? Her reply came fast. I said I'd ask you. He looked at the message, thought about Oliver, who asked about Maya after she hurt her ankle, who sat on cracked pavement to keep someone company, who carried Gerald to the bus every morning and said morning in a voice that was finding its way back from somewhere far off. Tell him yes, Ethan typed. Then, after a second, tell him I'll bring better frisbees. A pause. Then, he said Gerald is the only one worth throwing. Ethan shook his head slowly. He put the truck in gear. He's not wrong, he replied, and pulled out into the street. The weeks after that had a different quality to them. Not transformed, nothing flipped over into a new and better version of itself. The complications remained complicated. Victoria's schedule was what it was, which meant she canceled twice in August for things that were genuinely not avoidable and apologized in the precise way of someone who meant the apology, but also needed him to understand that the canceling was a feature and not a bug of who she was. He told her he understood. He did understand. Understanding it and always being okay with it would be different categories, long-term, but they were early enough that they didn't need to solve everything. He told Maya in early August. They were in the kitchen again, the same geography as every significant conversation in his life, and he told her directly because Maya was not a person you protected from information. She absorbed it for a moment, then said, Does Oliver know? Not officially. You should tell him, she said. He'll figure it out anyway, and it's better if it's not a surprise. She picked up her toast. He's perceptive. He is, Ethan agreed. It'll be fine, she said. He likes you, and she considered. She's kind of like Oliver in a way. She watches things before she says them. He looked at his daughter. When did you get this good at reading people? I grew up on a school bus, she said. What do you expect? He laughed at that. A proper caught-off-guard laugh, the kind that cost something. Maya grinned and took her toast and went to watch television. He sat in the kitchen and thought about what she'd said. She's kind of like Oliver. And thought about how he'd been on this route, all of it, for nearly a year now. A boy who sat still and watched before he moved. A woman who composed herself before she spoke. Both of them learning, in their own registers, how to trust a thing they couldn't control. And him, Ethan Carter, school bus driver, 32 years old, bad at saying things but apparently adequate at doing them, learning the same lesson from a different direction. He still had the drawing in his wallet, ETHN, OLIV. The two figures, the bus or sun. He took it out sometimes and looked at it, not for the sentimental value of the artifact, but because it reminded him of what the whole thing had started with before any of the rest of it. Before the gala, the video, the coffee, the park, the kiss on the sidewalk, a small boy on a bus, a seat behind the partition, hands folded on a backpack, and a man who just said hey there and meant nothing by it except, I see you, you're here, that's enough. He put the drawing back in his wallet and went to finish the laundry. September came back around the way it always does, without announcement, slipping in behind the last few days of August heat, the mornings suddenly different, cooler and sharper, the light at a new angle. Ethan pulled out of the depot at 6:47 on the first day of the new school year and drove to Wren Street, and Oliver was already there at the curb when he arrived, 5 minutes early, hands in his jacket pockets, backpack on. The red jacket from last spring had been replaced by a new one, dark green, slightly too big, the kind of practical size you buy a growing kid when you're thinking ahead. His hair had been combed with the same careful attention as always. Gerald the Frisbee was not visible, which meant it was in the backpack. Ethan opened the doors. Oliver looked up at him. Then he came up the steps, stopped beside the driver's seat, and said, Morning, Ethan. Not morning. 2 words, first name included. Ethan kept his voice even. Morning, Oliver. Oliver went to his seat, sat down, hands on backpack. Some things were continuous. But the boy who sat down was not the same boy who had climbed onto this bus 11 months ago with the stillness of someone bracing for impact. He sat differently. Not loose. He was still Oliver, still precise and contained, but without the sealed quality, the sense of a door closed from the inside. He sat like someone who was present and knew it and had decided that was acceptable. Ethan pulled out of the stop. In his rear-view mirror, he watched Oliver tilt his face slightly toward the window as the bus moved into the morning. Not pressed against it like he was trying to get out, just watching. A person looking at a city he'd decided to belong to. The new school year brought changes to the route. A few kids aged out, new ones came on. The particular sociology of the bus reshuffled itself the way it did every fall. Oliver now sat differently on the spectrum of it, not in the middle of things. Still the same seat, still not the kid who held court in the back rows. But he was adjacent to things in a way he hadn't been. Sophie Park offered him a rice cracker one morning, and he took it, which caused Sophie to look briefly like she might cry with satisfaction and then recover herself. Marcus Webb said something about a video game once, and Oliver responded with 2 sentences of specific technical information that left Marcus staring at him with new respect. He wasn't transformed. He wasn't a different child. He was Oliver, recovering, which meant he was still careful, still selective, still watching things more than he participated in them. But recovery is not transformation. Recovery is coming back to something you lost, and the something Oliver was coming back to was not a performance of normalcy or loudness or ease. It was just himself. The kid who paid attention to everything and had things to say and chose when to say them. Ethan watched it happen incrementally over those September mornings, the way he'd watched everything with Oliver. Without projection, without urgency, just present for what was actually there. What was also there in September was the question he and Victoria had been circling since the sidewalk in July. They'd been together for a word that was simultaneously accurate and insufficient. They'd had dinners, twice, without children. They'd had more Saturdays. She'd come to the apartment once on a Sunday and had sat at his kitchen table with a coffee and had an argument with Maya about the merits of a fantasy book series, which was not something Ethan had anticipated facilitating, and which had been, objectively, one of the more entertaining things he'd witnessed in recent memory. Victoria had very strong opinions. Maya had equally strong and entirely contrary ones. Oliver had sat in the living room playing with Gerald and had periodically contributed one-sentence observations that were accurate enough to derail both arguments, which neither combatant acknowledged, but both clearly registered. It was a complete mess of an afternoon, and Ethan had barely said 20 words the entire time, and he'd been happier than he'd been in a long time. But there was still a question of shape. What this was, where it was going, whether the pieces of it, his life and hers, his apartment and her house, Maya's school and Oliver's school, a bus route and a company, whether all of those things had a way of fitting together that didn't require anyone to disappear into someone else's world. He thought about it and didn't rush it. Victoria thought about it. He knew she thought about it because sometimes she went quiet in a specific way that he'd learned to recognize as processing rather than withdrawal. And once she'd said, without preamble, in the middle of a Saturday at the river, "I'm not good at depending on people." And he'd said, "I know." And she'd said, "That's going to be a problem sometimes." And he'd said, "Probably." And she'd looked at him like she expected more, and he'd said, "You're also not bad at learning things. You learned how to run a company. Depending on people is a smaller skill set." She'd thought about that for a while. Then, "That's either very optimistic or very naive." "Could be both," he'd said. She hadn't argued. That was something. Oliver knew. Not in the way of being formally told. Ethan and Victoria had agreed on honesty without announcement, which meant they didn't hide things, but they also didn't present the situation with the gravity of a press release. Kids pick things up through texture before they pick them up through information. Oliver was not a kid who missed texture. He demonstrated this on a Saturday in October, 6 weeks into the new school year, at the river trail. Ethan and Victoria had been walking slightly ahead of the children. Maya was behind them doing something with a stick that she'd explained as a science experiment and that mostly looked like hitting things. And at one point, Ethan had said something that made Victoria laugh, and without thinking, he'd put his hand briefly at the small of her back. 3 seconds. Nothing. Just a gesture. He'd glance back almost immediately. Instinct. Checking. And found Oliver watching them from a few feet behind. Not with alarm. Not with distress. With a particular focused attention that was Oliver's version of processing. Ethan removed his hand. Not dramatically, not guiltily, just let it go. Oliver continued walking. His face did its private sorting. That evening, Victoria texted, "Oliver told me at bedtime that you make me laugh. He said it like it was information he was filing." Ethan read the text. "Is that okay?" he replied. "He said it like it was good information," she wrote back, like he was adding it to a list of things he was sure about. He sat with that for a while. The formal conversation with Oliver happened in November because Oliver made it happen, not by demanding it, that was not Oliver's way, but by asking a question that required an answer. They were at the park on a Saturday, just Ethan and Oliver. Victoria had a board meeting, rescheduled twice and finally unavoidable, and Maya was at her mother's for the weekend. Ethan had offered to take Oliver anyway, because it was on the calendar and canceling felt like unnecessary disruption. And Victoria had accepted with the gratitude of someone who'd learned that accepting help was its own kind of practice. So it was just the two of them, walking the reservoir path, Gerald in Oliver's hand, the November sky doing its flat gray thing. Oliver was 7 now. His birthday had been in October, a small party at the house that Ethan had attended and at which Oliver had blown out candles on a cake with the expression of someone completing a task he'd agreed to. And at 7, he was taller than he'd been, his face losing some of the round softness of 6. They walked without talking for a while, which was fine. Silence with Oliver had never been an uncomfortable thing. Then Oliver said, "Do you love my mom?" The question went into the air between them and sat there. Ethan didn't look away and didn't rush the answer. He'd thought about this, in the abstract, the possibility of the question. He'd thought about what he'd say and what he actually believed, because those needed to be the same thing. "I care about her a lot," he said. We're still figuring out what it is, but yes, in the direction of love." He paused. "Is that okay to tell you?" Oliver walked for a few steps. He was looking at the path ahead. "Does it change things?" he said. "With us." It was not a child's question. Or rather, it was exactly a child's question in the way that children sometimes ask the thing that adults spend weeks avoiding. The real question, the one underneath all the others. Ethan stopped walking. Oliver stopped too, a step ahead, and turned to look at him. "No," Ethan said. "You were first. That's just true. Whatever I feel about your mom, that happened because I knew you first. And even if the rest of it didn't exist, you'd still be my friend. That doesn't change based on anything else." Oliver looked at him steadily. He was doing the thing. The calculation, the careful assessment that had been his mode since that first morning on the bus steps. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Okay," he said again, more firmly, like a decision that had been made and filed. He turned back to the path and started walking. Ethan stood there for a second. Then he caught up. They walked to the end of the reservoir path and back, and Oliver threw Gerald into the wind 4 times and retrieved him with a patience that bordered on meditative, and Ethan watched the November light on the water and said nothing further about love or change or any of the things that had been in the air between them. Some conversations end with a resolution, and some of them end with a door opened and left open, and this one had been the second kind, and that was enough. He told Victoria about it that evening. He was in his truck in her driveway, having dropped Oliver off, and she'd come out when she saw his lights and was standing by the passenger window. He told her through the glass, then rolled it down. She listened. When he finished, she stood in the driveway in her coat, arms crossed against the cold, looking at nothing in particular for a long moment. "He asked you that," she said. "He did." "What did his face do?" "After." He said okay and started walking. A long pause. "He told me tonight at dinner that the path by the reservoir was longer than he thought." Her voice was doing the controlled thing, the management. "That's all he said." "Sounds right." She looked at him. The porch light was behind her and her face was partly in shadow. "You said in the direction of love." "That's what I said." "Is that still accurate?" He looked at her. More accurate than it was this morning. She unfolded her arms, looked at the driveway. Then she put her hand on the window frame, close to his, not quite touching. "I'm not going to rush this," she said. "I need you to know that. I don't make decisions about my life quickly. I never have." I know. But I know what this is. I've known for a while what this is. Me too, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned in through the window and kissed him briefly and straightened up. Drive safe, she said. Always, he said, which wasn't entirely true given the truck's ongoing mechanical situation, but seemed like the right thing. He backed out of the driveway and drove home and went to bed at his regular time and slept, which felt significant only in retrospect. Winter came, then spring. He drove the route every morning. Oliver said morning, Ethan at 7:14 at the Wren Street stop, 5 minutes early, and Ethan said it back, and the route ran from the depot and back every day. And Maya argued with Oliver about books and frisbee technique and the names of constellations, which Oliver knew more of than any of them had expected and turned out to have opinions about. What was between Ethan and Victoria grew the way things grow when you stop measuring them. Gradually, and then suddenly, and then you look up one day and realize you're inside something real, built out of ordinary Saturdays and text messages and arguments about logistics and moments you didn't plan, and the thing is sturdy in a way you didn't engineer because you can't engineer that kind of sturdy. It either builds itself through use or it doesn't. It built itself. Not without friction. There were nights Victoria canceled and didn't sufficiently explain why until Ethan said flatly that he needed better than I had a thing. And she'd looked at him with that flash of irritation she got when she was also recognizing that the other person was right. And they'd had their first real argument, which was overdue and not pleasant and necessary. She told him he didn't understand the pressure of her schedule, and he told her that may well be true, but the pressure of her schedule was a thing he was now inside of whether he understood it or not, and that meant she had to include him in it rather than using it as a wall. She'd been quiet for a while, then, "No one has said that to me in years." Said what? That they were inside it, not that they accepted it, not that they understood, that they were in it with me. "I am," he said. She'd looked at her hands and then at him, and something in her face had done the private processing thing and then arrived somewhere different. "Okay," she said, "I'll be better." She was better, not perfect, that was not who she was, but present to it in a new way, communicating the schedule and the pressure and the things she needed instead of just managing around them and then being unavailable. He was not perfect either. He was, on the evidence, someone who held things quietly for too long before saying them, who was more comfortable being needed than being vulnerable, who occasionally processed his feelings through laundry. These were known facts about himself that he continued to navigate. He told Victoria about them directly, which she found both useful and slightly ridiculous. "You do process things through laundry," she confirmed once, after watching him fold a basket of towels with extreme concentration after a difficult conversation. "It gives you something to do with your hands," he said. "I suppose that's what the laundry is for." The proposal, when it happened, was not a production. It was a Sunday evening in March, a year and a half after the gala, 14 months after the sidewalk in July. 9 months after Oliver asked, "Do you love my mom?" on the reservoir path. Ethan and Victoria were in her kitchen, which had become a place he'd learned in the way you learn a place through repetition, where the good pan was, which burner ran hot, that the second drawer from the right got stuck if you pulled it straight and needed a slight upward angle. They were making dinner. She was doing something with vegetables and he was doing something with a pan, and Maya and Oliver were in the living room in the state of low-level ongoing disagreement that had become their default mode of interaction, which both of them appeared to find comfortable and neither would have admitted to enjoying. Victoria was in the middle of a sentence about something at work. The VP, the one who was right about everything and wrong about the way he was right about it, had finally reached the end of what she could manage, and she was deciding whether to restructure the team around him or have the harder conversation. And Ethan was listening and stirring something, and he looked across the kitchen at her, and she was gesturing with a wooden spoon to illustrate a point, and her hair was slightly disordered, and she was completely herself, not the version she presented to boardrooms or charity galas or the world that watched her publicly. Just her. In a kitchen, talking about a problem she was working through. He put the spoon down. She noticed the change and stopped mid-sentence. "What?" "Marry me," he said. She stared at him. "I don't have a ring," he said. I thought about getting one, and then I realized I have no idea what you'd want, and buying the wrong one seemed worse than none. So I don't have one. I can get one, or you can get one, or we can go together. I don't know how you want that to work. But I want to marry you, and I've been sitting on this for 3 months, and I didn't want to turn it into a performance. So I'm just saying it in the kitchen because this. He gestured at the kitchen, at the house, at the muffled argument happening in the living room about something that sounded like a fictional magic system. This is what I want. This is the version I want. So, Victoria looked at him. Her wooden spoon was still in her hand. The look on her face was the one he'd seen only a handful of times, the one where the processing was happening right on the surface, nothing hidden, everything there at once. You've been sitting on it for 3 months, she said. I told you I hold things too long. You could have, the New Year, that would have been, I didn't want to do it on a holiday. Valentine's Day. Absolutely not. She stared at him for another second. Then she set the spoon down. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. Less like an answer and more like a fact she was stating. Obviously, yes. Don't look at me like you're surprised. I'm a little surprised. You proposed in the kitchen with no ring in the middle of a conversation about my VP. And you said yes. I said yes. She looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and completely, unguardedly happy, two things occupying the same face at once, in the way feelings sometimes did when they ran out of room to be separate. You're so, don't say infuriating. Infuriating, she said. He crossed the kitchen and she met him halfway, which was, he thought, an accurate description of how most things between them had worked. From the living room. Are you guys being weird in there? Maya's voice, suspicious. We're cooking, Ethan called back. A pause. Then Oliver's voice, precise and unhurried. You're not cooking. The pan stopped. Ethan and Victoria looked at each other. We'll tell them at dinner, she said quietly. Yeah, he said. She picked up her wooden spoon. He went back to the stove. Dinner was ordinary. The four of them at the kitchen table, food that was slightly overcooked on account of the conversation that had intervened, Oliver eating with his specific neatness, Maya talking about something from school that had the structure of a grievance, but turned out to be a story she found funny in retrospect. After the plates were mostly done, Ethan set down his fork. Victoria was watching him. He looked across the table at Oliver and Maya. I asked your mom to marry me tonight, he said. He said it to both of them, but he looked at Oliver. Maya's fork hit the table. I knew it, she said. I told you, she said to Oliver. I said this was going to happen, and you said, I said probably, Oliver said. You said probably. That's basically the same as I knew it. It's not. It's basically, Maya, Ethan said. She stopped, collected herself, looked at him with the bright, genuine feeling she didn't bother to manage because she was 10 and didn't see the point. Are you happy? Yeah, he said. I am. She nodded firmly, as if this confirmed something she'd been tracking. Then she looked at Oliver. Your turn. Oliver looked at Maya, looked at his mother, who was watching him with the particular alert stillness of a woman trying not to put pressure on a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan waited. Oliver was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding something, not because he didn't know, but because he was choosing the words carefully, the way he always chose words, aware of their weight. Is our family, Oliver said, going to live together? That's the plan, Ethan said. If you're okay with it? Oliver looked at the table. His hands were flat on either side of his plate, not folded on a backpack, not sealed away, just his hands, resting. Maya gets the room near the stairs, he said. Maya looked at the ceiling. I literally already called that room. Because it gets more sun, Oliver continued. Her plants need the sun. I looked it up. Maya stopped talking. She looked at Oliver with an expression that was too complicated for 10 years old, doing what it sometimes did when Oliver did something that moved the ground under her. Then she looked at her plate and said nothing, which for Maya was the loudest possible statement. Yeah, Ethan said after a moment. She gets that room. Oliver nodded. Matter resolved. He picked up his fork. Victoria put her hand over her mouth briefly, removed it, straightened. "I'm not crying," she said. "I can see that," Ethan said. "I'm genuinely not crying." "Okay." Maya pointed at her own eyes significantly, and then at Victoria, which was her way of indicating that she was not convinced, but was willing to let it stand. They did the dishes together after dinner. All four of them, which was not the most efficient system, but had become the Sunday system, a rotating assignment of roles that Oliver had formalized with a small handwritten chart on the refrigerator that nobody had asked him to make, and everyone had started following. He took the organization of domestic systems seriously in a way that the rest of them found quietly hilarious and practically useful. Oliver washed, Maya dried, Ethan and Victoria put things away, which was the least skilled position and generally assigned to whoever had cooked, on grounds of fairness that Oliver had articulated once, and that no one had found a way to argue with. The kitchen was full of ordinary sound: water, dishes, Maya's running commentary on a story from school that had grown in the retelling, Oliver's occasional single-sentence contributions. Ethan put a pot away in the cabinet and turned back, and Victoria was at the counter beside him, and she looked up at him with the expression she had when she was present to something. Not managing it, not planning ahead, just there in it. He thought about that first morning at Wren Street. Oliver on the bus steps, the backpack and the folded hands, and the eyes older than his face. "Hey there." Nothing by it except acknowledgement. He thought about the crackers, the drawing. ETHNOLIV. The two figures, the bus or sun. He still had it. It had been in his wallet for a year and a half, and he had not taken it out. He thought about the word morning in a small voice on a January bus, after months of silence, spoken to no one in particular but specifically to him. None of it had been a plan. He hadn't set out to fall in love with a CEO or to become something essential to a boy who'd gone quiet with grief. He'd just driven the route and said hello, and treated a small person like he was a person and waited, without agenda, for whatever was true to show up. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that patience was a strategy, not that quiet consistency was a technique for winning something. It wasn't technique, it was just what you did when you'd learned, through whatever combination of experience and failure and paying attention, that you couldn't manufacture trust. You could only be trustworthy, repeatedly, without reward. And then see what it built. What it had built was a kitchen on a Sunday evening. A boy who said morning every day and carried a warped frisbee in his backpack and had a chart on the refrigerator. A girl who argued about magic systems with the focused passion of a person who took imaginary things seriously because real things had taught her to. A woman who was not easy to be with and was entirely worth it, and who had said yes in the middle of a sentence about her VP and him. Ethan Carter, school bus driver, 33 years old by then. Not more than he'd been, exactly, but more aware of what he was and less apologetic about the limits of it. He was not the hero of this story in the way that word usually gets used. He hadn't done anything dramatic. He hadn't swept anyone off their feet or fixed anything with a grand gesture or arrived at precisely the right moment with precisely the right thing to say. He'd been early to things and paid attention and not required anyone to be other than what they were. It turned out that was enough. Not because the world is fair or because goodness is always rewarded. He was under no such illusion. But because Oliver Hayes had needed something specific from the world at the time Ethan happened to be in front of him, and Ethan had happened to have exactly that thing, and neither of them had engineered it. Some things were just timing. The bus route, the October morning, a small boy on the first step deciding whether to trust the man in the driver's seat. And after the timing, everything else was just showing up. The wedding was in late August, 14 months after the kitchen proposal. Small. Victoria had wanted that, and Ethan had wanted that, and it had been one of the first things they'd agreed on without discussion. Frank's backyard, which was larger than it had any right to be, and which Frank had spent 4 weeks preparing with a seriousness that moved Ethan more than he'd admitted. String lights in the oak tree, tables with mismatched chairs, food from 3 different places because Victoria had decided early that a catered wedding was something she didn't want and had then become very specific about exactly which establishments should provide which dishes, which was such a Victoria way of doing things that Ethan had simply let it happen. Oliver stood beside Ethan at the ceremony. Maya stood beside Victoria. This had been their idea, jointly, presented to their respective parents one evening as established fact. Oliver had been characteristically brief about it. We should stand with you. Maya had been characteristically comprehensive. It makes more sense structurally, and also Oliver and I already know what we're doing from watching the rehearsal, and also we want to. No one had argued. The ceremony was short. They'd written their own vows, which had been harder for Ethan than he'd expected. He was not a man for whom language came easily, and standing in front of people and saying true things about himself was a particular kind of hard that no amount of preparation fully solved. He'd stood in Frank's backyard, in his own suit, and looked at Victoria in something simple and white that was exactly right for her, and at Oliver beside him in the navy suit from the gala, slightly too small now, which he'd insisted on wearing, and at Maya beside Victoria in a blue dress she'd picked herself and had opinions about. He'd read from the paper he'd written and revised 4 times. "I have been early to things my whole life," he read. "I have always thought that was about efficiency. I think now it was about not wanting to miss anything. I don't want to miss anything about your life, or about Oliver's life, or about the life the 4 of us are standing at the beginning of today. I'm not going to be perfect at it. I already know that. But I'm going to be early, and I'm going to pay attention, and I'm going to keep showing up for as long as you'll have me." Victoria didn't cry. She told him she wasn't going to cry, and she meant it. And she didn't, though her jaw did the thing, the controlled adjustment, and her eyes were very bright. Oliver, beside him, was very still. After the ceremony, when the music had started and people were moving toward food, and Frank was doing something with a speaker that Maya was supervising with concerned authority, Oliver appeared at Ethan's elbow. Ethan looked down at him. Oliver was looking at the yard. At the lights in the oak tree, the people, his mother across the way talking to someone and laughing the real version of her laugh. He looked at it all with that particular quiet attention that was just how he saw things. Then he looked up at Ethan. "I knew," he said. Ethan looked at him. "What did you know?" "At the gala?" Oliver's face was serious and certain. "When I walked across the room, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was right." He paused. "I could just tell." Ethan crouched down, same as he had that night in the ballroom in Frank's borrowed suit, meeting the boy at eye level, which was where Oliver deserved to be met. "Yeah?" he said. Oliver nodded, not elaborating. He'd said what he needed to say, and that was the whole of it. Ethan looked at him for a moment. "Me too," he said. Oliver held his gaze with that clear, serious look. Then something moved in it, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was the truest thing next to it, the expression Oliver made when a thing had been confirmed that he'd believed but not been certain of. He put his hand briefly in Ethan's, but the same gesture, the same hand, the same deliberate choosing, and then let it go and walk toward the food table. Because he'd said what he came to say, and Maya was over there, and the table had something that looked interesting. Ethan stayed crouched for a moment longer. The string lights were on in the oak tree, and the evening was warm, and the yard was full of the specific noise of people who were genuinely glad to be somewhere. Frank was winning an argument with the speaker. Maya was eating something before dinner was formally served, which Ethan had told her not to do, which she was doing anyway. Victoria caught his eye from across the yard and did something small with her face that was only for him. He straightened up. He was not a man who believed that everything happened for a reason, or that the universe arranged things with intention. He didn't need it to. He'd seen enough random hard things in his life to know that comfort and meaning had to be made, not discovered waiting. But some things you couldn't plan. Some things arrived in the form of a 6-year-old on a bus step on an October morning with dark eyes and folded hands and a grief he'd been carrying for 2 years. And those things, if you were paying attention, if you were present to them without requiring them to be something other than what they were, those things could build a life you hadn't imagined for yourself. The drawing was in his wallet. Still, the wallet was in his jacket pocket, and the chair where he'd put it before the ceremony. Etienne. Olive. 2 figures. A bus or son. He was going to keep it there. He walked across the yard toward his wife. Behind him, in the oak tree, the string lights held steady against the coming dark.